Back again, are we? You must have a taste for the terrifying. Tonight, we'll explore a story so chilling, it'll make you second-guess every shadow that creeps in your home. This happened back when I was in college. Spring break had just ended, and I was driving from my parents' house back to my college dorm. The drive itself was about 3 hours. There were a few small towns on the way, but other than that, it was pretty much just endless fields. I started my drive late, around 10:30 p.m. I was still making my way out of the town my parents lived in when I saw a hitchhiker walking on the side of the road. He was a tall, skinny guy carrying a duffel bag. As I got closer, he stuck out his thumb. I honestly felt really bad for the guy, and seeing as he was walking in the same direction I was going, I rolled down my window and asked if he wanted a ride. He named a nearby town and asked if I was going in that direction. I was, so I told him yes and unlocked the door. He got in the front seat, and I realized right away that he was a lot older than I thought, like, at least in his 40s. He kept to himself for a good part of the ride, which I actually didn't mind. I had the radio on, so it wasn't just awkward silence or anything. It wasn't until around 20 minutes into the drive with the guy that I started to think I made a mistake. The guy started clutching his stomach while groaning and complaining that he didn't feel well. He pretty much just hunched himself in the passenger seat, swaying back and forth. I told him to feel free to open up his window for some fresh air, but he never ended up doing it. To say I felt uncomfortable would be an understatement. Like, don't get me wrong, I understand if the dude wasn't feeling well, but here I am driving while just next to me is this guy groaning and swaying back and forth. There weren't really any towns or rest areas nearby. I didn't want to just tell the guy to get out and completely strand him in the middle of nowhere, so I kind of just sat there, trying to focus on the radio. This went on for another 15 minutes when the guy said, "Dude, I really don't feel good. Can you take the third next exit?" This caught me off guard. Not the part about wanting to stop, I was more so expecting him to say that at some point, but the part about the exit. The guy specifically said, "the third next exit." I remember those being his exact words. In the moment, I obviously thought it was weird. If I myself were sick, I would be much quicker to want to just pull onto the side of the road or at least take the very next exit. I asked the guy if he just wanted me to pull to the side of the road real quick, but he sternly told me no. This should have been a clear red flag, but I ultimately reasoned that the specific exit he wanted me to take must have had a rest area I was unaware of, so I agreed. A few minutes later, I took the exit, but absolutely nowhere in sight was any kind of rest area. I started pulling to the side of the road when the guy said, "No, keep going. We should go down a bit further." Again, this should have been a red flag I picked up on, but I did what he said. Eventually, he told me to stop. He got out and, within seconds, disappeared into the darkness. I waited for the guy to come back for a few minutes when I saw 5 hooded figures walking towards my vehicle, only revealed by the light of my headlights. They were clearly carrying weapons and now charging towards my vehicle. I threw the car in drive and started darting in the other direction, but they actually started shooting at me. From what I recall, 5 gunshots were fired, 2 of which hit the back of my car. Even still, I was able to get out of there. I didn't stop the rest of the way back. I did call the police and report it, but I never got any follow-up. When I made it back to my dorm, I found the bullet holes in the back of my car. I think it's worth noting that one of them was only a couple of inches from my tire, which makes me think whoever was shooting was aiming for the tires, but I'll never be able to know for sure. I don't fully know the motives of that hitchhiker that night, but at least to me, it's obvious he intentionally lured me into that specific spot, which, might I remind you, was nowhere near any type of civilization. I have since never picked up another hitchhiker. This happened multiple years back when I was around the age of 12. I was an only child, and back then, my family only had one car, which my dad would usually take to work each weekday. This meant any time my mom had to go somewhere while he was at work, she would either have to walk or hitchhike. Now, it should be mentioned that back then, hitchhiking was a lot more socially acceptable. Plus, at the time, we lived in a decently small town where, for the most part, everyone knew everyone. From what I can recall, this took place on a Thursday. My dad had dropped off my mom and me at the grocery store on his way to work. This, of course, meant we would have to find a ride back home. Though we'd done this many times before and never had any issues, only a couple of minutes into our walk back home, a driver pulled up next to us, willing to give us a ride. It was some guy in a white pickup truck who we had never seen before. He told us to get in the back, and we did. My mom started giving him directions to our home from the highway, but it honestly looked like the guy was just ignoring her. When we came to our exit, this was confirmed as he straight up drove right past it. The guy then went on to explain how he had to make a quick detour first. This was extremely unnerving, but after a while, we came up to a farm. The driver took out the keys, told us to wait in the car, and disappeared. My mom clearly didn't know what to do. I mean, we couldn't just leave. We were in an unfamiliar area in the middle of nowhere. A few minutes later, the driver came back, but now with a second guy. The guy looked at us and started flipping out, screaming at the driver. Now, I'm not sure if this is exactly what was said, but this is what I can remember. The guy screamed at the driver that he shouldn't have brought someone with a child and that there's no way anything can happen now. From what I recall, more things along those lines were said, but I can't remember exactly. The driver then got back in the truck and apologized to us. My mom sternly told the man to take us back to where he had picked us up. She technically hadn't given him our address yet and, for obvious reasons, now did not want that information known. The drive back was done in complete silence. Looking back, my mom and I both agreed that the purpose of that stop was not as innocent as a simple detour. We honestly see ourselves as lucky for making it out of that situation. We lived in that town for 5 years after that and never once saw those two guys again. This took place in November of 2005. Each year, my job would give us 10 vacation days. Seeing as I hadn't yet used any this year, I decided to take a week off to visit different states around the US. To get around, for the most part, I would actually hitchhike, which is something I've done multiple times in the past. Despite all the horrible recognition it gets nowadays, I actually really enjoy doing it. I've met a lot of people through hitchhiking that I still call friends to this day. Anyway, it was around 2:30 p.m. I was walking down the road giving the usual thumbs-up signal hitchhikers typically give. It had been a while since my last ride, and I'll be the first to admit I was getting a little desperate. Eventually, a red pickup truck pulled up next to me. Inside were two men. My best guess is they were in their 40 years old. One of them asked me where I was going, to which I responded. They both looked at each other for a second, then back at me, and signaled me to get in. They seemed normal enough, so I tossed my bag in the back, got in, and shut the door. But I quickly realized the whole floor of the vehicle was completely covered in different types of bullets. Before I had time to even rethink my decision, we were already going 60 down the highway. I tried to engage in some small talk to ease the tension, and it actually sort of worked. But somehow, the topic landed on how one of the guys had just gotten out of prison for aggravated assault. A disturbingly short amount of time later, they started asking me how much money I had. This is when I started to realize I could be in some serious danger. Now, I had been hitchhiking for a couple of days by that point. I didn't look the best, so I tried to play it off that I was homeless and had no money whatsoever. This response was met with complete silence. For the next 30 minutes or so, not a single word was said, though multiple times I would catch the driver looking up at me through the rearview mirror. I honestly just tried to ignore it, something I regret doing to this day. Fast forward 20 minutes, and to my horror, the driver turned off the highway and started down some unpopulated dirt road. I instantly shot up and said, dude, where are we going? After 15 seconds of no response while the car was still driving, I grabbed my bag, unlocked the door, and dove out of the car. Instantly, I looked up to see the red pickup slam on its brakes, shortly after followed by the reverse lights turning on. I cannot explain to you how fast I got up and ran into a nearby cornfield. I ran for 5 minutes when I swear I could hear gunshots behind me. They were clearly distant, but still, I ran for another 5 minutes until I reached the sign for the main highway. I then called the police, explained the situation in my current location, and waited in the cornfield until an officer arrived. I was then driven to the nearest police station, where I filed a police report. Though in terms of descriptions, there wasn't really much I had to give other than 2 men inside a red pickup truck. I hadn't gotten the license plate number, and I didn't even really see the full faces of the guys or even remember them. The whole situation was no doubt the scariest thing I've ever experienced. I don't completely know what those guys had planned, but I truly believe I could have lost my life that day. While I still hitchhike occasionally, I am now far more cautious in the cars I get into. It was a rainy night and I was driving home from my shift at the late-night diner I work at. It was a quiet shift at work. I had a weird amount of energy still, so I knew I was going to have to pop a melatonin when I got home. I was driving my usual route, a scenic road during the day but majorly dark at night, lacking many light posts. There are occasional little parking lots with cute little strips of stores or family-owned restaurants and shops, and then just stretches of nothingness. And by nothingness, I mean forest. I was passing one of the aforementioned parking lots of a well-known deli, and under a light post was a woman standing out in the rain with her arm held out. She was waving me down. I slowed as I realized it was a slightly older woman who appeared to be in her 50s, maybe. This woman was really tall, like 5 feet 11 inches or 6 feet, but very skinny. I lowered my window and yelled, "Do you need a ride?" She came over to the front door and opened it, chanting how much of a hero I am. I asked where she was heading, and she said just up the road to town. She was soaking wet, getting my car all wet, but I like to think of myself as a good person and I couldn't, in good conscience, leave another woman out there in the cold rain. However, picking up a random man on the other hand would be a different story. The woman seemed sweet, but I noticed as I looked at her while talking to her that she was missing a few teeth, very, very off-putting. I had to now wonder if she were homeless. She didn't smell or look like a homeless person, though, but the rain soaking her and her clothes could have been masking any scent temporarily. Plus, her hair was so wet that what may have usually been scraggly undone hair could now have been weighted down and straightened by the water. Either way, the woman was smiling the whole time and didn't seem like a threat. We pulled up to an intersection with a gas station on one corner. I pulled in next to a pump, might as well fill up. I asked her if she wanted anything from inside. I was really doing my good deed for the week. She said, "No thanks, honey," so I went inside to pay the attendant for gas and some spiked seltzers since tomorrow was the weekend. When I got back to my car, the woman was gone. I looked around the gas station lot real quick, but it was tiny. She was gone. She must have run off somewhere. I felt slightly bad, feeling like she was some lost helpless woman, but part of me also felt slightly relieved. I filled up the tank of my SUV and was on my way home. When I got back to the house, I went straight inside my apartment, which is the first level of a two-family house. There's a tenant upstairs and me. The front door into the foyer was usually left unlocked, then the two doors leading to each apartment were locked. I let myself in out of the rain and into my apartment. I set the seltzers down on the counter. I wasn't that tired yet, so I took a melatonin and tried to go to bed. Even with the melatonin, though, I was having a hard time sleeping that night. My mind was kind of going wild with thoughts, a lot of thinking about that woman I picked up earlier and what happened to her. At certain points, I heard slight sounds from outside of my bedroom, but I dismissed them as sounds from the upstairs tenant. Boy, do I wish I had been more suspicious before falling asleep. I woke up in my dark bedroom, something that usually would never happen when I take a melatonin. I usually sleep like a baby through the night. I sat up, feeling drowsy and really thirsty too. I reached over the table next to my bed for my water, and then I saw and heard something across the room from me. I saw someone crouched in the corner of my bedroom behind a clothing dresser, with their legs folded. I had to be hallucinating it. I shook my head violently and made weird noises. I even slapped myself in the face, and now whoever was in the corner stood up and walked out of the room. I didn't scream, I didn't say a word. I sat in my bed in literal shock. The part that had me questioning my sanity for a bit after the figure was gone was that there wasn't a single sound from outside the room after this, no footsteps, not the sound of a door closing. I grabbed my phone and called my dad. He picked up, confused why I was calling so late. I told him what I just saw, and he said, "Carter, you probably just had a night terror." I stayed on the phone with him as I was continuing to become more awake. I left my room and turned on the lights to the living room outside. It was a small space, there was no one in there. I looked around the entire space and could confirm no one was there. I started to believe that maybe I did just hallucinate it, but still, I slept with the bedroom door locked that night. When I woke up in the morning, I drank some coffee and got dressed for the gym. I went to open the door to the foyer and realized it was already unlocked. My heart sank. Last night, what I saw, was it real? I did another look around the apartment, confirming no one was inside. I went out to my car and opened the back door to put my gym bag in the back seat, and that's when I noticed the damp yellow-brownish stains all over the floor in the back, and my blanket that I always had back there was gone. I wanted to cry or scream. I figured it out. That woman snuck into the back seat last night when I was in the gas station. She either somehow unlocked the door to my apartment, or I mistakenly left it unlocked. I called my dad again, frantically asking him what to do. He said, check and make sure nothing was stolen, and if nothing was, then calling the police really wouldn't do anything. I checked the house and didn't find anything to be missing, just my blanket from the car. I skipped the gym that day. In fact, I stayed bottled up in my apartment for a while after that. I was just genuinely disturbed. I didn't want to live there for much longer after that, and so after that month, I found a new place to live. My friend Michael was throwing a house party. I arrived early to help set things up. I secured a spot to sleep in his parents' room, meaning I could drive to the party and drink without having to worry about driving home. His parents obviously weren't home for the night. Most of our close friends in our friend group came, plus a bunch of Michael's friends who I didn't know. The party was fun. At midnight, everyone screamed "Happy New Year" and cheered their drinks. After that, people slowly started circulating out, and the party started to quiet down as people went to either other parties, bars, or home. The later the night got, the more it became just the closer friends staying behind, until it just turned into a chill drinking session in the living room. This went on late into the night. It was likely 2:40 a.m. when the last of everyone who wasn't sleeping at Michael's house was gone. As it quieted down, we started hearing this occasional sound. At first, we didn't know what it was, but it soon started to sound like a creaking sound. It was dismissed as a sound from the fridge or something at first, which I know sounds stupid, but house appliances often make weird noises. It was just Michael, me, and Lloyd. Lloyd was falling asleep on the couch already. It was reaching that time where we were just going to go to sleep. However, eventually, we got so bothered by the noise that we had to search. We went to the kitchen, and it wasn't coming from in there. We realized when we were close to the basement door that it was coming from downstairs. Michael opened the door, and we heard this creaking sound. "Go check what it is," I said. He kept saying, "No way." Then he called down into the basement, "Yo, who's down there?" The creaking stopped, and we never heard it again. After a solid minute of waiting at the top of the stairs, we agreed to go down together. We both grabbed knives, drunkenly thinking that was a good idea, when in reality, we were so drunk we'd probably only hurt ourselves with them. We got to the bottom of the stairs and looked through the entire basement. It's not huge, it just has a couch, TV, a bar, a table in the corner, and various old pieces of junk. It was pretty messy at the time. The first thing we did was search any possible crevice for someone who could be hiding. Then we tried to figure out what could have been making that sound. I noticed a rocking chair, and so I went up to it, sat in it, and then started rocking in it. It made the exact same creaking sound we had been hearing. Michael and I looked at each other. I stood up, and so did every hair on my body. I don't think we ever ran faster than we did when we ran up those stairs and slammed the door shut. We tried to come up with any logical explanation, but there was none. He kept the basement door locked for days until his parents came back. There was no living soul down there, but something was moving that rocking chair. That rocking chair used to belong to his grandma, who passed away forever ago, and it's just something his mom held on to for sentimental reasons. I can't say I've ever experienced anything resembling the paranormal before this, nor since then. It still sends chills down my spine. This happened when my now husband and I were moving from the east to the west coast of the US. This had been our second time making this trip, and this one was just to pick up a few last things and grab our 2 dogs. At this point, we were just trying to make good time since we were tired of being on the road and would only stop for food and restroom breaks. So we weren't strangers to rest stops at odd hours of the day. I can't remember what state this happened in because we do a lot of traveling, and rest stops have all blurred together over the years. Anyways, my husband had been driving for a while, and it was time to switch off, walk the dogs, and stretch our legs. So we pulled into a rest stop around 3 o'clock or 4 a.m. There was only one other vehicle in the lot, most likely with someone sleeping inside of it, and not that many truckers in the truck area, so the rest area was fairly empty. I jumped out of the car and let my husband know I was going to run into the restroom before I let the dogs out. While I ran in, he was going to hang out by the car to have a smoke and keep an eye on our dogs. However, we parked our car by the dog area, and to get to the restrooms, you had to walk over this hill. You couldn't see the restrooms from our car. Being late at night, my husband decided to walk most of the way with me to make sure I got there okay. I wasn't worried but didn't mind the extra comfort of having him there. I finished up in the restroom and came out to walk the dogs and let my husband take his restroom break. Even though it was late and I felt a bit cut off from the lighted area of the rest stop, I wasn't worried. I'm small and don't weigh much, but my dogs are German Shepherd mixes and very protective of me. Plus, I was taught self-defense at a young age and feel capable of defending myself if the time came. So I'm walking my dogs and letting them do their business when I noticed that one of the semi-trucks, which had been sitting on the far side of the stop, starts up and slowly drives in my direction. This didn't seem worrisome to me because they were on the trucker's side, and I assumed they were heading to the exit to get back onto the highway. I grabbed 2 doggy bags to clean up after my dogs and started heading to the trash can. As I'm walking, I'm suddenly blinded by bright headlights. I looked in the direction of the lights and saw that the semi, which I thought was leaving, had pulled up as close to the truck lot and car lot divide as possible and now had its brights aimed directly at me. Pissed off that someone was blinding me with their brights, I quickly tossed the poop bags away and started walking back to my car. As I'm walking away, the dude starts flashing his lights over and over again. I'm almost to my car, wondering if I'm missing something and becoming more and more irritated. He starts creeping his truck in my direction again while flashing his lights. My dogs sensed my irritation and immediately went on alert, staring in the trucker's direction. I finally made my way to my car, and the guy is still flashing his lights while stopping his truck in my direction again. I don't scare easily, so I decided to stand there and glare in his direction. Then he finally stopped flashing his lights. Good, I assumed he was done and started getting my keys out to unlock the car. Suddenly, my dogs stiffened beside me, their hackles raised, and they began to growl. I heard the sound of a door opening and turned back in the trucker's direction. I saw his door was now opened, and I saw a foot starting to exit the truck. I'm sitting there thinking this guy is a complete idiot when, at this point, my husband shows up and wraps his arm around me while flipping the trucker off. The trucker's foot disappears back into his truck. He shuts his door and leaves the rest stop pretty fast. I told my husband about him flashing his lights, and he explained that truckers use this method to flag women down at rest stops for sex. I was grossed out. I'm guessing he thought I was alone because of how the rest stop was set up. However, I was in no way dressed like someone interested in random sex at a rest stop. I was wearing layers because it was cold and driving a newer car. Plus, what idiot thinks it's a good idea to try to approach someone with 2 huge dogs? Although I was never scared during the whole thing, I do think the situation was creepy because the guy was obviously not quite there and was acting pretty abrasive. All started with a camping trip. Me and my girlfriend, let's just call her Lee, were young and dumb, blissfully unaware of the cosmic curveball life was about to throw our way. Picture this: crisp mountain air, crackling campfire, the Milky Way sprawled across the velvet darkness. Textbook postcard perfect. Except the postcard ripped in half when we woke up the next morning, disoriented, clothes rumpled, and with a gaping hole in our memories where the previous day should have been. We brushed it off as a weird shared dream, a glitch in the matrix, but a niggling unease settled in our gut, a premonition of things to come. Back in the familiar chaos of college life, things got weirder. Lee, normally the picture of health, started experiencing these unexplainable physical oddities, dizzy spells, nausea, heightened sensitivity to light. Then came the bombshell, pregnant. Impossible. She was on the pill religiously. The doctors were as confused as us, their tests revealing nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, as the weeks ticked by, the strangeness intensified. Lee's body became a battleground, her health fluctuating like a runaway roller coaster. One week she'd be glowing, energetic, the next, pale and listless. The baby inside her, meanwhile, seemed to be defying the laws of biology, growing at an alarming rate. The ultrasound session was disturbing. Before Lee and I knew what we were looking at, the technician ended the session. She seemed disturbed, leaving with no explanations given. Both Lee and I were beyond bewildered, bordering on desperation. My countless calls to the specialist's office only yielded the frustrating response, "The doctor is busy. He will call you back." But that call never came. Determined to uncover the truth hidden in those ultrasound images, I took matters into my own hands, parking myself near his car after his workday. The specialist was visibly shocked to find me there. There was no subtlety in my approach. I practically tried to force an answer from him. His bewildered expression shifted as he hesitated before urging, "Tell your wife to get an abortion." That's all I got from him, nothing more. His profound fear caught my attention. I couldn't fathom why he seemed so terrified about our baby's unusual condition. Then, the arrival of a black van nearby intensified his distress. His eyes fixated on it, and the fear seemed to double. As I left, deliberately passing close to the van, the driver's window lowered. Two men in suits and sunglasses shot me an eerie look. As the doctor drove away, the van started up, following him ominously into the unknown. The fear gnawed at me, a constant unwelcome companion. It was this creeping sense of being watched, a feeling like unseen eyes were tracking our every move. Then came that night in the apartment. We woke up, not to the comforting hum of the fridge or the distant sirens of the city, but to a bone-chilling silence, broken only by the frantic thumping of our hearts. In the inky blackness, a presence loomed, unseen but undeniable, radiating an oppressive dread that seeped into our very bones. I am telling you, that night there was more than us in that apartment. Only the Lord knows what that presence was, but it felt otherworldly. We fled that night, seeking refuge in Lee's parents' house, the unease clinging to us like a second skin. That's when I started getting anxiously suspicious about the gap in our memories from the night out camping in the wild. The pieces started falling into place, the strangeness of that event, the unexplainable pregnancy, the constant feeling of being watched. They all pointed towards something not of this world. The doctor's frantic insistence on more tests, his desperate pleas for termination. What further fueled my suspicion was that the doctor always had excuses not to see us or kept the sessions ridiculously short, never giving any clear answers to any of our questions. To myself, I wondered if it was his way to punish me for the time I creeped up to him in the parking lot, or if he was hiding something from us, possibly both. This wasn't a normal pregnancy. This was something else entirely. God knows what. Lee, bless her heart, refused to listen. Motherhood blazed in her eyes, a fierce determination that trumped logic and fear. She was going to have this baby, no matter what the test said, no matter what dark secret it held. Eventually, I decided it's better to let her live her naive dream. Denial can be bliss. I was hoping that she was right. I was hoping it was merely me being paranoid. If the baby was abnormal, we would have it anyway, if that is what she wanted. The climax arrived like a sucker punch. Lee went into early labor, the doctors acting frantic, their faces etched with worry. Then came those two men in suits, their expressions unreadable, barring my entry to the delivery room like guardians of some forbidden secret. It was like they were hiding something, something terrifying. When they finally let me in, it was over. The baby, they claimed, died during the procedure. We never saw the body. Some fabricated story about a mix-up, an admin error. A wave of relief washed over me, an undeniable sensation despite the crushing grief clawing at my insides, a hollow echoing in my chest. Lee was devastated. It was slow, but time heals all, and she recovered. The years that followed were a haze: marriage, 3 beautiful, normal children, a life built on laughter and love. We tried to build normally and succeeded to a large extent. And that is our story. Yet it does not end there. Sometimes I wish it did. Ignorance would have been a simpler path. Something was off. Both of us shared nightmares, became our unwelcome souvenir. We never spoke of them, but the knowing glances confirmed our mutual torment. Weeks of normalcy could be shattered by a single morning, both of us awakening as if we'd relived that night in the wilderness every time, both of us at the same time. Its synchronized nature was disturbing. These random nightmares could come at any time. It couldn't continue. When our youngest, barely 5, noticed our erratic behavior, his innocent question cut deep: why are mommy and daddy in such a bad mood some mornings? Desperate for answers, we confided in a trusted psychologist. He suspected suppressed joint trauma and referred us to a hypnotherapist and her practice partner. Our separate but simultaneous sessions with the 2 hypnotherapists uncovered the horror. It all came out, or most of it in any case, or so we believe. Gosh, I think we would have preferred the amnesia. The memories were horrific: the oppressive silence of the woods, the sudden blinding light that filled our tent, the feeling of weightlessness as we were lifted skyward, the colossal metallic craft hovering silently above. Then came the figures themselves, tall and slender with elongated limbs and skin that seemed to shimmer in the otherworldly light, their faces shrouded in shadow, radiating an unsettling calm. Their movements devoid of human emotion, their large almond-shaped black eyes, that is one thing that I can't get out of my mind since the regression sessions. And of course, those creepy 6-fingered hands touching everywhere. The details were terrifyingly clear: the sterile examination rooms, the cold metal instruments, the unsettling hums and piercing screams. We were not the only ones. They forced us apart. They controlled our bodies and movement. We were taken to separate rooms where we endured unspeakable experiments. From me, they extracted samples, a primal instinct telling me it wasn't what later transpired with Lee. For her, they did something far, far more monstrous, invasive, and unbelievable, manipulating her body and planting the unwelcome seed of that child. We didn't know their motives, but had to endure their cold touch and emotionless indifference. Emerging from the therapist's office, we clung to each other, trembling, tears mingling with the bitter stain of confirmation. Those fragmented memories finally coalesced into a horrifying whole, confirming our darkest suspicions. We weren't just abducted, we were subjects in some experiment, unwilling pawns in their grand design. Regular therapy sessions became our battleground, where we wrestled with the horrific memories and lingering trauma. Despite the semblance of normalcy we rebuilt, the shadows of our experience clung to the corners, whispers of what if clinging to the air. But the heaviest shadow loomed large: the baby, the one we lost. The burden became unbearable, a weight threatening to crush us both. I embarked on a mission for answers, tracking down the retired doctor across state lines in a Sarasota restaurant. Years etched on his face mirrored our own. He unveiled the truth: the 6-digit codes on tiny limbs, the oversized head, the huge black eyes like bottomless voids. Each unsettling detail chipped away at our hope, while the revelation of its survival, spirited away by shadowy figures claiming government affiliation, plunged us into a new abyss of fear and confusion. There's more to the story, secrets too unsettling to share in the open, but one even if the answers lead us deeper into the darkness. I faced a grim battle with a rare blood cancer, one that offered little hope for recovery. With the harsh reality of my condition looming over me, I made the tough call to forego treatment, accepting the uncertain road ahead with a heavy heart. In the weeks leading up to Christmas of the year in question, our secluded farm on New Zealand's South Island bore witness to a peculiar phenomenon. Strange lights danced across the evening skies, their erratic movements defying explanation. At first, we mistook them for PLS, but their sudden shifts and unpredictable patterns hinted at something more enigmatic. Our farm, nestled in solitude and isolation, seemed a world unto itself, far removed from the chaos of urban life. The sightings of these mysterious lights became our own private intrigue. We refrained from discussing it with anyone. One night, a week before Christmas, as we sat down for dinner, I noticed through the window a light descending on the paddock next to the house. When it touched the ground, I could see it was a disc-shaped craft. Instinct kicked in, and I reached for my trusted hunting rifle, hands quivering with a blend of fear and determination. But before I could even grasp it, they emerged, creatures straight out of a nightmare, their insect-like forms contorting in the dim light of our home. There they were, right inside our lounge. No idea how they so suddenly entered. It's like they just materialized. Their presence suffocated the air. It felt like the gaze of these four beings pierced one's very person. We were in a state of hyper-shock. Mary stood behind me, arms protectively enveloping our daughter. Mary recalls our innocent Leah seemed wondrously amused by the creatures, while Mary and I were in a state of pure anxiety and dread. We stood frozen, trapped by an invisible grip, unable to break free from the fear that held us in place. Despite my efforts, my limbs refused to obey, rendering my weapon useless against the encroaching darkness. I don't think any words can describe what was going through my mind at that time. While you are reading or listening to this, imagine for a while being in such a bizarre and threatening situation. While doubting my eyesight at that moment, in fact, doubting my very sanity, I simultaneously am confronted with protecting my wife and child against creatures that can simply materialize or dematerialize as they please. All of this while they control my body, rendering me absolutely incapable of my duty as protector of my young family. The entire thing is simply too ghastly to describe. That experience left a lasting mark on me. As swiftly as they had appeared, they vanished, leaving us trembling in the wake of their inexplicable visitation. This eerie experience was a chilling reminder of our vulnerability in the vast expanse of the unknown. As Christmas Eve enveloped us, the air buzzed with the anticipation of the cherished family gathering in festive mart. The following day, our joint families were driving all the way to spend Christmas Day at our place, stay over the night, and drive back on Boxing Day. Despite the shadow cast by my illness, we had painstakingly prepared for the occasion, fueled by the promise of love and laughter that awaited us. Mary, ever the embodiment of resilience, orchestrated the culinary symphony in the kitchen with practiced finesse. The aroma of roasting turkey and freshly baked pies wafted through the air, a tantalizing preview of the warmth and joy that awaited us on the morrow. Yet beneath the facade of holiday jubilation lurked a solemn reality, a truth I had grudgingly come to terms with. This would be my final Christmas, a poignant reminder of life's transience and the relentless march of time. The events of the previous week were still on our minds, but as it caused no harm except for freaking us out, we decided that we would not let it feature in our thoughts for the next few days. If only it was going to be that simple. As the night wore on and darkness blanketed our home, a disturbance shattered the tranquility. I jolted awake, a sense of disquiet creeping through me like a silent specter in the night. Emerging from the comfort of my bed, I stumbled into the enveloping darkness, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. As I bore witness to a sight that terrified me, one of those very same otherworldly creatures was in our house. As I stood in the hallway, I saw it slipping into Leah's room like a phantom in the night. It seemed not to notice me, or maybe it was simply not bothered by my presence. Fear spurred me onward, my footsteps resounding through the silent corridors as I hastened to my daughter's side, only to find her bed and room empty. They had taken her, but how? Panic seized me. I grasped for the phone, desperate for aid in the face of the unknown, but fate, it seemed, had different plans. The telephone lines remained eerily silent, they were dead. The familiar hum was replaced by a chilling stillness beside me. Mary stood, her features etched with a blend of fear and disbelief. We found ourselves adrift in a sea of uncertainty, our world unraveling with each passing moment. Suddenly, there was a flash of light. I thought it was the craft outside taking off, whisking our daughter away, only the Lord knows where to. And then, as if beckoned by some unseen force, a wave of dizziness swept over us. The next moment, I felt sick. I remember Mary saying her head was spinning. Strangely, we both fell unconscious right there by the phone, both of us at the same time. If it was not so strange, I would have said our collapse was brought on by sheer shock, but I firmly believe it was something else. Look, both Mary and I, even amidst my illness, were pretty level-headed people. We were not the type to simply faint. The morning broke with the events of the night before veiled in a haze of uncertainty. As awareness slowly returned, I found solace beneath the covers. Mary's reassuring presence by my side offered comfort in the midst of turmoil. The covers in bed. How did we get to bed? My last memory was of us losing consciousness in the hall by the phone. But then a worse memory, Leah. They've taken Leah. Then something unexpected and beautiful happened. A sweet, innocent voice beckoned us from our slumber, drawing us to the warmth of the lounge. There, bathed in the soft morning light, sat Leah. Her laughter was a melody that chased away the dread and fear. Relief washed over us like a tidal wave, cleansing our hearts of doubt and anxiety. She was safe, untouched by the darkness that had threatened to consume us. We held her close, her embrace the ultimate gift I would receive on that Christmas day. As we basked in the joy of her presence, a sense of peace settled over our home, a peace forged by the unbreakable bond of family. We never discussed the events of the previous night or days with our family. Despite the horrific events leading up to our Christmas, the day itself turned out to be a beautiful experience of love and joy. As it was going to be my last, I only wanted to focus on making that Christmas the best memory for Mary, Leah, and our folks. We kept it that way throughout the festive season. New Year's came and was another joyous event with friends and family. Yet after that, life had to return to its normal routine, and with that returned the doubt and fear. Beneath the surface, a lingering doubt nagged at us, a question unanswered. What had truly transpired on that fateful night? And why did Leah's memories remain veiled in mystery, her innocence untainted by the chaos that had engulfed us? We sought answers as the new year broke. Without revealing too much, as we did not want them to think we were crazy, we had Leah checked out by a pediatrician and a psychologist. Both found her to be in excellent health and showed zero signs of trauma of any kind. So the truth remained elusive. Leah, a beacon of hope, stood unwavering in her innocence, her laughter a reminder of the resilience of youth in the face of uncertainty. However, her apparent lack of any trauma amidst what happened to her puzzled us. Yet, we were grateful our daughter was unscathed by whatever happened to her. Then February came, and it was time for my visit to the oncologist. Even though I knew what the path forward looked like, these visits were required to manage my condition as best as the clinicians could. I steeled myself for the tests and examinations. Blood was taken, and we had to be back for a follow-up the next day. I prepared for the inevitable affirmation that the cancer was staying its course. My only dread was that it might be speeding up, which would mean even less time with my family. When the specialist finally entered with an expression of confusion, I knew he had further bad news for us. Then our world changed. His words, when they came, shattered the darkness like a beam of light. Your cancer is gone. I will never forget his words. I remember him saying something like, "You are extraordinarily lucky. This type of cancer simply does not disappear by itself. Besides, severe cases like yours have never been successfully treated. Yet, here you are, clean, without any treatment." More tests were done, but they all confirmed the same. It was a miracle, pure and simple, a reprieve from the brink of death that defied all reason. Jubilation surged through me as we made our way home, hope and gratitude intertwining in a dance of newfound life. Yet with all that I had to celebrate, something was unresolved. At the edges of my consciousness, something was awakening, an unwelcome guest in the midst of celebration. And then, like a storm on the horizon, the nightmares descended, a relentless onslaught of visions and memories, each more nightmarish than the last. Strange lights and alien faces haunted my dreams, their presence a specter that loomed over me in the dead of night. With each passing day, the memories grew more vivid, more visceral, until the terror etched into my being. I relived the ordeal in agonizing detail, the chill of extraterrestrial surgical instruments, the pain of probing, incisions, grotesque needles, and more, all inflicted by beings that seemed devoid of empathy or remorse. Amidst the darkness, a paradox emerged. It was bittersweet, for within their cruelty, the insectoid creatures bestowed upon me a gift beyond measure, a second chance at life, burned through pain, sheer dread, and horror. The ordeal is too harrowing to recount in further detail. I cannot fathom why the creatures subjected me to such torment. Lily, now married with 3 beautiful children, remains as joyful and vibrant as ever. Untouched by the events that transpired all those years ago, despite undergoing regression hypnosis at our urging, she recalls nothing of significance. Curiously, it appears she was never abducted. Sarah and I seem to have manufactured memories of searching for her at home. Sarah never developed any nightmares or memories even remotely like mine. After all our anxieties about the apparent abduction of Lily, it seems that I was the only one who got taken. The motives behind the creatures' actions remain shrouded in mystery. Nevertheless, their intervention led to my survival. Faced with the choice between enduring these haunting memories and succumbing to cancer, is there truly a choice? Thousands of beautiful memories created by a long and fulfilling family life have made the horror of the abduction 100% worth it. We received a chilling account from a brave individual who endured a harrowing encounter with enigmatic beings from another world. In this video, we delve into the spine-tingling story of their abduction and the shocking twist that left us questioning the nature of such abductions. I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to share an experience with you, something that happened to me one fateful night that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. It was a late weekend night, and I found myself driving down a desolate stretch of road surrounded by farms and dense forestry. The full moon bathed the landscape in an eerie silver glow, and I was deep in the heart of nowhere. As I continued my journey, I noticed an unusual light in my rearview mirror. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it was either another vehicle or the radiant full moon casting unusual shadows. However, my unease grew when a sharp beam of light suddenly engulfed my car. Panic coursed through my veins as my vehicle began losing power, the engine sputtering to a halt, and every electrical system shutting down. With trepidation, I stepped out of my car to investigate the source of this mysterious light. What I encountered next would defy all reason and logic: a flying saucer, yes, a UFO. The sight was unlike anything I had ever seen. It had landed right in the middle of the road. My heart raced as I watched in awe and terror as 3 small gray beings emerged from the craft. I know this might sound unreal, but the experience was real and simply terrifying. These beings were small, no taller than 3 feet, with slender bodies and a gray complexion. Their heads were disproportionately large, featuring oversized pitch-black almond-shaped eyes that shimmered with an otherworldly intelligence. They only had the slightest of noses and what seemed like slits for ears. Their mouths were also subtle lipless slits. Their fingers were long and delicate. These small but scary beings were clad in sleek, form-fitting bodysuits that bore an eerie jet-black hue. The fabric seemed to adhere closely to their diminutive frames, emphasizing their slender and otherworldly appearances. These suits appeared to be made of a material unlike any I had ever encountered, possessing a peculiar sheen that hinted at an advanced and unfamiliar technology. The texture of the suits had an almost metallic quality to them, adding to the otherworldly aura that surrounded these beings. It was as if these beings, dressed in their enigmatic black suits, were emissaries from a realm that defied human comprehension, leaving me with more questions than answers. As they approached me, walking with an uncanny grace, I felt a strange sensation wash over me, as if they were communicating with me through some form of telepathy. They moved in unison, their movements fluid and synchronized. Without uttering a word, they conveyed a sense of urgency, gently guiding me toward the entrance of their craft. It was as if they had the ability to exert control over my actions, making resistance futile. The hypnotic spell they cast upon me left me with no choice but to follow their lead, stepping through the metallic threshold of their enigmatic vessel and into an entirely new and unsettling reality. Inside the alien craft, I found myself in a room that defied any earthly description. The walls seemed to be constructed from a seamless silvery metallic material, casting an otherworldly shimmer across the entire chamber. There were no discernible corners or edges, creating an unsettling feeling of disorientation. The room was bathed in a soft bluish light that emitted from concealed sources, casting eerie shadows in every direction. In the center of the room lay a peculiar silvery metal slab, its surface smooth and polished to a mirror-like sheen. The slab had restraints of an unknown design, composed of a material that resembled a translucent gel-like substance. These restraints seemed to respond to the touch of the aliens, conforming perfectly to the contours of my body as they secured me in place. It was as if the slab itself was a living entity, adapting to their will. Surrounding the slab were an array of strange and intricate instruments, unlike anything found in human technology. Some emitted faint rhythmic hums, while others displayed holographic readouts that I couldn't comprehend. Tubes and wires snaked across the room, connecting to various devices, and it became clear that I was the subject of their experiments. The atmosphere was charged with an otherworldly energy, and my fear was palpable as I lay helpless on the metallic surface, unable to comprehend the full extent of what was about to transpire. The aliens surrounded me. While I was on the slab, one of them pulled down a mechanical arm with a kind of needle extending from it. He brought it towards my eyes. At first, I freaked out, but then my faith kicked in. As I am a spiritual person, I knew I had only one resort of help to turn to. It is because of my faith that I discovered a peculiar phenomenon. Every time I called out to my Creator and began to pray, something incredible happened. It was as if a divine presence filled the room, and I became certain that the Creator Spirit was with me. My prayers seemed to unnerve my captors, and I realized that my faith was a powerful weapon against them. Their fear was palpable, and it was evident that they were afraid of something far greater than themselves. It seemed to terrify them. With each prayer, they backed away, unable to withstand the spiritual force that protected me. As I continued to pray fervently, an astonishing and unexpected sight unfolded before my eyes. One of the little gray aliens, the one closest to me, suddenly exhibited signs of intense fear and distress. Its large, almond-shaped eyes widened even further, and it began to emit high-pitched, distressed sounds that I can only describe as a mixture of chattering and whimpering. In a shocking turn of events, the alien's body language conveyed sheer terror, and to my astonishment, it began to involuntarily urinate, causing its tight suit to become soaked with a pale liquid. The liquid pooled around its feet, creating a strange and unsettling scene within the sterile metallic chamber. It was as if my prayers had triggered a profound and unexpected reaction within the creature, revealing a vulnerability I could never have anticipated. This bizarre and surreal moment served as a reminder that, despite their advanced technology and seemingly superior knowledge, these extraterrestrial beings were not immune to fear. There were forces beyond their understanding that could instill terror even in the most enigmatic of creatures. It was a turning point in my harrowing ordeal, as I realized that my faith had the power to influence and protect me in ways I could never have imagined. In a twist of fate, they eventually released me, dumping me by the side of the road not far from where they had abducted me. As I watched their craft disappear into the night sky, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of awe and gratitude for the divine intervention that had saved me from an unimaginable fate. This experience has forever changed my perspective on the mysteries of the universe. It serves as a reminder that even in the face of the unknown and the terrifying, there is a force greater than anything we can comprehend, a force that shields us from the darkest of terrors if we turn towards it. My island on June 28, 1947, Captain Tony, who worked as a harbor patrolman officer in Ireland, was on patrol with his 2 rookies, his son, and his dog. However, this was no ordinary day at sea. When Tony gazed up into the sky from his patrol boat, he saw 6 aircraft floating around 1,500 feet above his watercraft. The objects were reported by Tony and his crew to be made of a reflective material and were shaped like flat donuts, about 100 feet in diameter. The center holes located on each craft were noted to be about 25 feet in diameter, and more circular objects were located along the sides of the aircraft, which Tony and his crew determined to be observation windows. Soon, Tony and his fellow crewmen noticed that 5 of the UFOs circled over the 6th, and the 6th itself was lowering towards the patrol boat. This caused immense panic among the crew because they all thought that the aircraft was going to collide with their patrol boat. Not wanting to be sent to a watery grave, the crew hightailed it toward the shore. Upon reaching the shore, Tony retrieved his binoculars to spot the bizarre aircraft from the shore. He also grabbed his camera to take photos as evidence of the strange aircraft. While taking the pictures, the lower craft stayed in a still position while the 5 others circled around it for about 5 minutes. Then, the lower aircraft suddenly dropped down but stopped abruptly at about 500 feet above the water. One of the 5 ships circling around the lower ship came down to meet it. The 2 crafts stayed in this position for several minutes until Tony thought he heard a thump. Instantaneously, more thumps followed, and Tony, using his binoculars, saw that the middle aircraft was dropping what Tony suspected to be newspapers from the inside of its center hole as it swiftly approached his watercraft. When the aircraft got close enough, it was discovered that the objects weren't newspapers but instead white, lightweight metals and black, lava-like rocks. Tony even stated that when the lava-like rocks landed in the sea, it caused the water to steam. With these dangerous pieces of debris falling ever closer to their boat, the crew sought cover below deck. However, not before one of the materials struck Tony's dog, killing it in the process, and another one wounded his son in the arm. Tony even tried to radio for assistance, but the transmitter wasn't functioning. Even though his radio was out of action and no help was on the way, most of the debris splashed into the water. Soon after the raining of metals and rocks, the airships rose up high into the sky and zoomed westward together. The crew then exited the lower deck and examined the boat for any damage. Luckily for the crew, the boat was hardly damaged, and they set sail back to their dock, lowering the dog over the side and into the water in the form of a burial at sea. Upon docking, Tony took his son to the hospital so that his wounds could be treated and afterwards explained the incident to his boss, Mark, who didn't believe Tony. When the photos Tony took of his patrol were printed and examined, the strange airships Tony had informed him of and showed him in the now-developed photos were compared and believed to be film noise and damage caused by radiation. Not wanting to shy away from proving the incident's authenticity, Tony returned to Ireland to collect rock samples in hopes of finding the ones dropped from the middle aircraft that he had encountered during the incident. Tony reported that while he did this, he spotted one of the aircraft hovering above him as if it were spying on him. He eventually gathered the rocks and was preparing to show them to his boss the next day. But when that day came, he was visited by a small, pale man in a black suit. The man suggested that the pair of them should get breakfast together, to which Tony agreed. So, he followed the stranger to a restaurant. While they ate breakfast together, the strange man asked no questions but instead gave a descriptive account about what Tony had witnessed the previous day and eventually warned Tony that bad things would happen not only to him but to his entire family. Men then acknowledged that Tony had been telling the truth. So, the pair of them sent a package to publisher Ray Palmer in Chicago, who later founded Fate magazine. The contents inside the package were the metal fragments and statements about the strange incidents and findings on the 21st and 22nd of June, a noteworthy incident that we continue to discuss and debate amongst ourselves to this day. Yet not even a month later would another incident occur that is possibly the most well-known and talked about alien encounter in history, Roswell. On July 8, 1947, in the small town of Roswell, New Mexico, there were reports of a flying disc that crashed into the desert not far from the Walker Air Base. This made front headlines around the world. The reports noted that bodies of aliens had been retrieved from the crash site and were hauled to the infamous Area 51 Air Base in the Nevada desert, where autopsies were performed and carried out. Shortly afterwards, a press release by high military authorities stated that rumors of a flying saucer had become something of a reality and that an intelligence officer at the Roswell Army Airfield was fortunate enough to gain and hold possession of one of the saucers. This statement sent newspaper reports of the incident around the world insane, and news headlines of this Roswell flying saucer were everywhere. However, just 24 hours later, that high military authority changed their story, stating that they had made a mistake and that the flying saucer was actually, in fact, a weather balloon. Unbelievably, the public appeared to have accepted this explanation, and very little was said about the Roswell incident for many years afterwards. It wasn't until the late 1970s when some military personnel involved began to speak out about what happened all those years ago, and ufologists, as well as conspiracy theorists, went into overdrive, thus developing the Roswell case into the incident as we know it today. One of the first military personnel to speak out about the Roswell UFO incident was Major Jesse Marcel. He was one of the 2 military personnel sent to investigate the crash site. The other one who was with Major Jesse Marcel was Sheridan Cavett, who had always claimed that he wasn't even there. Major Jesse Marcel described how large amounts of metallic debris were scattered all over the area, so the craft had obviously hit the ground at a high speed. He stated that it was clearly not a weather balloon, aircraft, or missile because he recovered fragments from the crash and described seeing hieroglyphic types of writing painted on it. The metal was also reported by him to be light, thin as paper, but incredibly strong and hard, which was unlike anything he had ever seen in his career and life before. He also helped answer the question as to where the fragments were taken by simply saying not only did they have the one he analyzed but others as well, which are being kept well preserved in a military installation somewhere. Marcel's story doesn't end there, however, because later in life he told his expanding family about his investigation at Roswell. According to his grandson, my grandfather Marcel would privately share details of his experiences with the entire family. And when I was a kid, basically around the dinner table, he told us how he was the head of intelligence and lead investigator of the 509 bombing group. He would talk about it with people, continuously asking a multitude of questions about the Roswell UFO incident. The National Security Agency published a report in 1994, a staggering 47 years after the initial incident, which stated that the alien bodies supposedly recovered from the crash site were, in fact, just life-sized test dummies. Many saw this as the government just trying to dig itself out and cover up the situation, which only continued to fuel conspiracy theories. Lots more witnesses came forward and spoke out about the Roswell UFO incident, including a photographer who claims that he was asked if he could photograph the crash site. He explained how he was asked to take photos inside a dark-tinted area where he observed 4 identical bodies with humongous heads and shadowy skin. After taking the pictures, he was debriefed and ordered to forget everything he noticed at the crash site. But then a witness more credible than everybody else combined spoke out just before he passed away in 2005. His name was Lieutenant Walter Haut, the man who published and released the original weather balloon report back in 1947. Before his passing, he wrote and left a sworn affidavit in which he claimed that the weather balloon story was a cover-up for the UFO that had been successfully recovered from the crash site. He also confirmed that he had seen dead alien bodies in this still widely debated Roswell UFO incident. With these 2 incidents raising so much speculations and questions, one might ask if we will ever know what went on. However, as the years fly by and as the people who were involved or witnessed these incidents pass away, we are really only drifting further away from the inevitable answer. So until the government sheds light on this mystery or the next incident does that for us, we can only continuously marvel at the fact that these two instances combined have been not only the gateway to extraterrestrial debates as we know them today, but also might just be the biggest government cover-ups in history regarding human contact with alien and otherworldly beings. Though these two events are the most widely renowned encounters with extraterrestrials, thousands of encounters have been reported throughout the world to the present day. I never told anyone this story because I never thought they would believe me. I was home alone one evening and had gone to sleep for the night. I lived with my significant other and 2 indoor cats, but she was out of state traveling for business. My junior year in college, I had a strange experience. First, a few background details. My dorm room was attached to my roommate's, so I had to go out through hers to get to the bathroom or the hallway. She was a light sleeper, but I wasn't the type to be out late, so it didn't matter. I had 2 normal operations in my life at that time and discovered that while under anesthesia, I would wake up briefly toward the end before I was supposed to. If I got a mosquito bite, I had to deal with it for at least a month. I'm not a fast healer. One night, I had the most vivid dream of my life. I woke up briefly somewhere else and then went right back to sleep. In this dream, I looked left, I looked right, and then I passed back out, just like if I was in surgery. I was on a hospital gurney, slightly inclined, facing the wall. There was ambient noise behind me, and the echo suggested it was a very large room. There was nothing sinister about the noises. On either side of me was a row of empty hospital gurneys. At my feet, just to my right, 2 people were having a conversation sitting on a bench against the wall. One was a person in a dark suit, the other, I don't know what it was. It was small, and I saw its hands, which appeared to have darker, grayish skin. They were speaking together, so animated and excited, like 2 old friends who hadn't seen each other in years, and they didn't notice me wake up. I didn't recognize the dialogue. Though I don't speak German, Mandarin, Russian, etc., I can recognize them when I hear them. This language was wholly unrecognizable, yet the person in the suit was fluent. I went back to sleep. In the morning, I said to myself that that was a messed up dream and went to the shower. As I passed my roommate, who was still in bed, she asked, "Where did you go last night?" I thought that was odd. After my shower, I started to put my makeup on and noticed something on my face. I leaned closer and could not believe what I saw, 2 perfectly parallel lines, impossibly thin and impossibly perfect. There was some clear hard gel on the top, and that's what I felt. There was no blood. My own hair was thicker than the width of the cuts, yet I could see down into my skin a little. This was 1996. I had never seen anything like this. These days, I would say it was a laser cut topped with liquid Band-Aid, but neither of those things seemed prevalent in those days. I said, "Okay, there's an explanation. I slept on a staple or a paper clip. I do homework in my bed all the time. I went and scoured my pillow for anything sharp and found nothing. So, I got my sewing needle, a staple from some homework, and a paper clip. I dunked them in hydrogen peroxide and made cuts on my face similar to what was there. Immediately, blood welled up, and the skin was jagged from all 3 objects, and the width of all cuts was thicker than the laser cuts. I determined that nothing in my room could have made the cuts. I didn't have an X-Acto knife, but I knew the blood would well up the same way if I did. I skipped my first class as I tried to figure out what to do. I kept obsessively feeling my face all day, in awe of the perfection of what was there and how it could have come to be. There were only 2 people on campus rich enough to have a digital camera, which meant I would have to borrow a friend's 35mm because I didn't have my own. That meant I would have to explain myself to my friend and possibly the photo shop when the pictures came back. Who would I even give the photos to? Who would I even contact, and what would I tell them? In those days, if you even said the word alien, you were a pariah. After hours of mental debates sitting on the edge of my bed, I gave up thinking about it and finished my classes for the day. I sat on the edge of my bed into the night, debating, unsure of what to do. In the wee hours of the morning, I woke up. The cuts were gone, completely healed, no trace of even a scar. I was disturbed for a few days, but then I eventually forgot about it. A few years after graduating, I decided I was going to have some dental work done and went to 2 different offices to get quotes. They both took a full facial X-ray. I had long since forgotten my crazy dream and the cuts until I sat down across from the first X-ray technician and pointed to a strange thing showing up above my teeth. I asked if I was looking at a mirror image because it was on the same side as my cuts had been rather than the opposite side. No, I was told, the X-ray was actual, not a mirror image, so the right side of the image corresponded with the right side of my face. I pointed to the almost square image above my teeth and asked what that was. "It's just an X-ray anomaly," he said. He didn't seem bothered by it. I figured that meant there was some damage or irregularity with the X-ray plates and let it go. Then I went to the second dentist, an orthodontist, and had another X-ray done. You guessed it, the square was there in the exact same place. This time, I didn't even try to make polite small talk or beat around the bush. I pointed to the square and said, "What is that?" This time, the tech looked at me funny and said, "It's an X-ray anomaly," and she leaned closer and whispered, "We see them all the time," in a way that gave me goosebumps. This was in Spokane, Washington. I didn't know what else to say, so I said nothing. Could it be that whatever negatives or plates or whatever they used for an X-ray were damaged in exactly the same spots and exactly the same shape? Maybe, I guess. I don't know much about X-rays. But after that, I reflected on my situation. I don't feel freaked out, but I think there might be something in my face put there by somebody else. Here's what I know, we do this all the time to other species. We chase them in helicopters, shoot at them with tranquilizer darts, take rectal temperatures, take blood samples, stamp radio tags in their ears with no regard to if it hurts or the trauma of the event, or if their furry buddies will ostracize them later because they have something funky on their ear. In my situation, I was clearly well cared for, if it really happened at all. Someone was there as some kind of representative on my behalf. I was handled in such a way that if I didn't have a weird metabolism, I wouldn't have known what even happened. I never once felt pain. My cut healed instantly. If this is some kind of research-driven radio tag for the purposes of data collection or preservation of habitat or species, like we would do, they did it with far more regard for me than we have for other species on our own planet. I don't know what might happen if I get another X-ray 20 years later. I have tried to look when I go through airport security if anything shows up on the image we see in the booth, but I don't see anything. Surprisingly, I'm okay with this. I think it might just be science and nothing nefarious or evil. I wish my consent to be asked first, but I suppose it's hard to ask for consent when you're not even supposed to exist. I worked from 9 to 5, then came home, ate, and then worked on the old house to get it ready to sell. One night, after an exceptionally long and rough night of working on the house, I was on my way home when I saw in the sky something that routinely is not there. I stopped to watch the object only to see it not move at all. Now, realize this is around 1 a.m., and it's not a hot air balloon or anything like that, especially since I have never seen one in my area of Ohio. What I was looking at was an oval. It was wider than it was tall. The object, as many people explained, was not giving off light but was illuminated, if that makes any sense. I was so tired I almost wanted to shrug it off, but I just couldn't for some reason. Not only was it way too bizarre, but what I had been wanting for the last 48 years was happening right before me, my first and so far only UFO sighting. To say I felt spooked would be an understatement. I got back into my car and drove the short 1,000 feet or so to get to my driveway and to the safety of my new home. I knew there were details I was not able to see because of the way the craft was illuminated. Then it dawned on me, nobody's gonna believe me. So, at 1:30 a.m. on a school night, I went into the house and scared my daughter and son by waking them up to witness what was in the sky. I hoped to God it would be there still, and sure enough, it was sitting right there where I left it. I am covered in goosebumps just recalling my daughter's reaction. My son was a huge skeptic, but even at the age of 12, when he witnessed it, looking back he knows what it was. I saw fear in his eyes. He stayed out with us for about a minute or two, then went back inside. My daughter and I were almost speechless. It was beautiful in a way, but we both agreed that it gave off a feeling of fear or dread, like we were not supposed to be seeing this. Then it struck me, I should get some binoculars. I happened to know right where they were because I did most of the boxing for our move. I grabbed the binoculars and was stunned at what I saw. The best I could describe it was it looked totally old on the bottom, like it was made from old clad iron ships long ago, pounded out metal, like with rivets and seams. The top looked very modern, I guess you could say. I remember it had something that resembled what I would call headlights on the back window, like some old cars. I also remember the top almost being shaped like a genie's lamp. My daughter looked through the binoculars and had a terribly similar description. Then I saw something that freaked me out even further. It now looked as though the craft was sitting on a long, thin, yellowish pedestal. I could not figure out what I was now seeing. I gave the binoculars to my daughter, by the way, she was 16 at the time, and asked her to explain to me what she saw at this time, what had changed. I could hear the absolute fright and quiver in her voice. I will never forget what she said. "Dad, there's a beam of light coming out from under whatever it is. I'm scared, Dad. I think we should go in." We could not shake that feeling of fright and the feeling that we should have never seen what we did that night. Both of our bedroom windows faced out directly where this craft could be seen. I found out later my daughter stayed up until morning on live video chat with her friends, absolutely terrified. After showering, I laid in bed exhausted but overwhelmed by what we just saw. It was at this point that I noticed the craft was moving, but at such a slow rate it was undetectable until I was able to compare it to something stationary, which was my vertical windowsill. I will never forget that dull, eerie, pale yellow light this craft illuminated. I forgot to mention that if you held out your arm, the craft was just slightly larger than the width of your thumb, if that makes any sense. I was told later that that is quite large. Eventually, the craft traveled out of sight, and I crashed from exhaustion. Every year our small town has a fairly popular carnival and rodeo. It's pretty much the only thing anyone around here looks forward to, or lows, considering how many drunk tourists seem to find their way here and make fools of themselves dressing like cowboys. One night during the carnival 2 years ago, my mom decided to take my brother, myself, and 2 of my friends for the night to have some fun. We ended up parking on a residential street a few blocks away from the fairgrounds because there's no parking pretty much anywhere else. After a half-ass attempt at remembering the name of the street and the general area where we left our car, we all went on our way. Well, later that night, we couldn't remember for the life of us exactly where the car was. We searched street after street for 30 minutes with no luck. Finally, my mom, after seeing how tired we all were, told us to sit on the curb and wait while she went and looked. We were all well aware of stranger danger and were in a nice neighborhood, plus the community rarely has problems with violence of any sort, so we 3 15-year-old girls and 1 12-year-old boy thought there was nothing to worry about. 5 minutes after my mom disappeared, we hear the grass crunching on the lawn behind us, and all of us whip around to see who was now standing there. An older, lanky man with a hunchback and the coldest expression I'd ever seen was staring at us. Because his back was hunched, he stood there kind of crookedly. He didn't move or blink as he glared at us. "Why are you sitting on my curb?" he snapped, still not moving. It was unnerving how still he was. We immediately felt guilty, thinking this was just some scared or confused old man wondering why some teenagers were sitting outside of his house. I explained the situation to him, that my mom had gone to find our car and we would move across the street if we were bothering him. He stayed silent for a few seconds, then stared me down and said, "Come inside." The next few minutes are a blur as my adrenaline kicked in, and I was getting more and more scared of this man by the second. We didn't have the sense to just run. For some reason, he kept repeating, "Come inside." "What are you waiting for? Come inside my house. Get over here now. Get in my house." No matter what we said, he didn't seem to hear, and he thankfully didn't move from his spot on the lawn, like he just expected us to come with him. He was especially focused on my friend and me, just telling us over and over again to go with him inside his house. No matter how much we tried to get in his head that my mom was coming back soon, the look in his eyes just kept getting colder and more furious the longer he stood there. It didn't occur to me that his hand had been hidden behind his back the entire time until my mom showed up. We were all relieved, saying, "See, we told you, there she is." And like now, my mom is a scary woman. She does not take shit, and she'll happily start throwing punches if she feels the situation calls for it. So immediately she was in Mama Bear mode and furiously telling off this old man after she saw how freaked out we all were. He was just now starting to move back to his house. He slunk away from her and glared at the four of us, batting his free hand at her, cursing and mumbling to himself. We watched him go, and as he turned around, my blood went cold. In the hand that he had been hiding was a large knife. It glinted off the street lamp, and we all hurried away to our car that my mom had found. My friends and I tried to laugh it off, but we were all scared and not willing to be alone for the rest of the night. It's seriously scary to think about what was running through that old man's head, especially since he was holding that damn knife the whole time. So, creepy old man with a knife behind his back, let's not meet. Why I'm done with the local fair. Every year since about the 5th grade, I've gone to our little town fair. It used to be in the mall parking lot, huge, well-kept, polite staff, and always busy for the week or so it was here. But the last 2 years, it's been rather small and kind of shady. The staff moved to a smaller, empty lot behind our local Outback. This year, my boyfriend took me as a little, "I'm sorry we're not going to prom" gesture. We're walking around for a little bit. It's still pretty early in the day, so it seems like mostly little kids and their parents are there. He and I decide we'll go to ride the bull, something I've done quite a few times growing up going to rodeos. This was his first time. I paid for him and begged him to do it with me. I explained what he had to do, how he can't hold on with 2 hands and whatnot, and he does well for his first time, about 15 seconds at full speed and shaking. Now it's my turn. I hop on and ride with no issues. I'm wearing skinny jeans, so I'm not entirely shocked when I get a wolf whistle about the little bit of lace that got flashed on one turn. Turning around thinking it was just my boyfriend, I walk off and walk back up to him, dizzy. A carny comes up and tells me I was one of the longest riders in this town. I quickly thank him and give him a big, proud smile, holding on to my boyfriend. He quickly pulls me away to the carousel and leans down to kiss me. I stand up on my tiptoes to reach him. The same carny, apparently working this ride, comes up to us and, in the most sarcastic tone possible, goes, "Aren't you cute?" Keep in mind, this guy is probably about 30 years old and smells like weed mixed with fair food. He looks at my boyfriend and goes, "But maybe she deserves someone a little better fit for her, or at least knows how to ride a bull." I pull my boyfriend out of line, pissed off and grossed out. He tells me we'll go when the guy's not there. We walk around some more, get some treats, and ride some other things. Probably about an hour later, we head back to the carousel. I'm carrying my big stuffed koala bear, and we get back in line. No sign of the creepy carny. We get our wristbands, stand, and get on. I sit on the outside while my boyfriend sits on the middle horse. The ride's going, and suddenly the creepy carny is back. He hops on quickly and holds on to the pole my horse is attached to. He just stares at me for a bit until I go, "Can I help you?" My boyfriend is watching, slightly amused. I'm not something to be messed with, and he knows as much. The carny looks at me, his gross yellow teeth stretched out in a grin, and goes, "Yeah, how about you show me more of that lace, and I'll get you a bigger bear than that sad thing." I'm completely disgusted and creeped out. I tell him to fuck off before I call the cops, and he's not getting the message until the ride stops. My boyfriend stands up, he towers over this guy and goes, "Hey, she said fuck off or I'll have the cops here in 2 minutes." The creepy carny buggers off and follows us around the rest of the night until I'm so freaked out we have to leave. So, creepy carnival worker, let's not meet again. Starting a new job is always a mix of excitement and nerves. When I landed a summer job at a local carnival in downtown LA, I was just looking for some extra cash before my senior year of college started in the fall. The carnival was a typical setup with rides, games, and food stands, but its main attraction was the fun house, which doubled as a haunted house after dark. It was actually a solid structure that I think used to be some old guy's mansion or something. I was assigned to manage the fun house, which was a favorite among the carnival goers. It seemed simple enough: guide the guests in, ensure they have a fun, safe time, and observe them leave. At first, everything seemed straightforward, but then I started noticing odd things. It started with small discrepancies. I'd count a dozen people entering, but only 11 would emerge. At first, I chalked it up to miscounting. After all, keeping track in the chaos of laughter and screams was no easy task. However, as the days passed, the numbers just didn't add up. 7 went in, 6 came out, 10 went in, 9 came out. Was I going crazy? Something was off, and I couldn't ignore it much longer. One particularly busy afternoon, a blonde girl caught my eye as she walked up to the fun house. She was drop-dead gorgeous and almost seemed out of place amidst the childlike atmosphere. She couldn't have been more than a few years older than me. I genuinely had to do a double take. I'm not a weird guy by any means, but I couldn't help but lock eyes with her for a few seconds. She smiled, handed me her ticket, and I directed her into the attraction. After she disappeared into the darkness, I went back to my duties. Time ticked by, and I watched attentively as people entered and exited, sometimes asking me questions and whatnot. Admittedly, I was paying a little more attention to the guests that night, as I wanted to see that girl as she left and maybe work up the courage to talk to her. Pretty soon, I started picking up on the fact that groups of people who had entered after her were beginning to emerge. A few more minutes passed, and I started getting worried. She should have been out by now. Compelled by genuine concern, I decided to abandon my post for a few minutes and go looking for her. I stepped inside and locked the entrance door. I began investigating, navigating the dimly lit rooms and narrow corridors. I moved through the house until I came across something I had noticed during my initial walkthrough, a barely noticeable seam in the wall. I'm not really sure what I was expecting, but curiosity got the best of me. I pressed against the seam, and I heard a distinct click. I played around with it some more, and my jaw nearly hit the floor when I realized it was a hidden door. It swung open slowly, revealing a pitch-black hallway. I stood there in shock. What in the world was this doing here? I was definitely going to have a long conversation with my boss about this. I walked into the hallway with my phone's flashlight guiding the way. I didn't have much brain power to spend being nervous because I was still so shocked about the whole situation. I got to the end of the passage and found another door. I flung it open, and to my surprise, it was a concealed exit that led back to the carnival grounds. I breathed a sigh of relief as this discovery proved I wasn't going crazy. All those people I had noticed leaving the attraction had probably stumbled across that secret door by accident and assumed it was the correct way to go. As I walked back the way I had come, I couldn't help but feel a little bummed out that I wasn't going to get the chance to talk to that girl. I'm not sure what came over me, but I decided to keep exploring the fun house instead of returning to my post. I think a part of me just wanted a few extra minutes of this impromptu break I was taking. I walked through a couple more rooms, and that's when I noticed it. On one of the walls was another faint seam identical to the first one I had seen. I again played with it until it clicked and swung open. I could immediately tell this one was very different. The putrid smell was the first thing I noticed. More concerning, though, was the fact that there was no corridor in this one, but a ladder. A ladder that led downwards. I was more confused than anything. This door was on the ground floor, and I was told specifically that this place didn't have a basement. I debated climbing down, but I just felt awful about the prospect that the girl might be down there. So, against my instincts, I began the descent. The smell only got worse as I climbed down into the darkness. I was expecting to find a basement, but what I found instead was far, far worse. I got to the bottom and pulled out my phone's flashlight. I was frozen in shock. I was literally standing in a tunnel that extended into the darkness. There was literally no way that this was part of the house above. The rational part of my brain screamed to turn back, to forget about it, but the mystery was too compelling. I ventured further, being careful not to make any noise. The walls were damp, and the tunnel was completely silent. As I explored, my flashlight beam fell on something unexpected. A white glittery purse was sitting in the middle of the corridor. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It looked familiar, and then it hit me. It was that girl's purse. I was sure of it. I started to panic. Was she really down here? I doubted there was any way a rational person could find this tunnel and not turn around, but the proof was literally in my hands. My mind started racing. Was she hurt? Lost? And then a more terrifying thought hit me, was she alone? I didn't feel safe anymore, but I was in too deep. Violating every survival instinct I had, I yelled out into the tunnel for that girl. I waited. Nothing. I was just about to shout again when I heard the sound of rapid footsteps echoing through the tunnels. My first instinct was to run. I had every reason to believe whoever was running toward me was hostile. I turned around and bolted back to the ladder. I got halfway up and slipped, falling back to the bottom. The footsteps were basically right on top of me now. I knew I was done for. I braced myself for a fight, and then a voice rang out, a girl's voice. Her voice. She gasped, clutching her side as if in pain. I yelled at her to climb up, but she insisted that I follow her back into the darkness. For some reason, I told her there was no chance I was doing that and basically forced her up the ladder. We got to the top, and I slammed the door shut. I asked her how in the world she ended up down there, and she couldn't really give me a straight answer. She kept saying she didn't really remember how it happened, just that she suddenly realized she was underground. She said she started hearing things moving in the dark and that there were voices calling to her. I didn't know how to process this. I asked her if someone had guided her down there, and she said she didn't remember. The weirdest thing about her story was that she was looking at me with this blank stare that genuinely freaked me out. I basically interrogated her about why she told me to stay down there, but she didn't answer. I had had enough. I wanted to get as far away from this person as possible. I called the police, but she opted to leave the fun house before they got there. I never saw her again. The police investigated, and what they found was actually insane. Apparently, this house had been some sort of safe house during Prohibition in the 1920s. As such, it had a bunch of secret passageways that led to a section of the underground Prohibition tunnels that hadn't been discovered. The owner claimed he had no idea about the house's history, but I was skeptical. I quit my job and got as far away from there as possible. I still have so many questions. Did the owner know about this? Was that girl almost kidnapped? Had someone knocked her out and taken her down there or something? Was she part of the whole thing? I feel like there are a number of explanations for what happened to me, but all of them are equally terrifying. Ever since I was a kid, I loved carnivals. The lights, the games, the unpredictable joy of it all. I know lots of people find them weird and childish, but not me. Growing up in a small town in Indiana, it's not like there was a whole bunch to do. So whenever the carnivals would roll through town, you best believe I was spending as much time there as I possibly could. It's been over 20 years, and I still enjoy the atmosphere of a local carnival. Despite what I'm about to tell you, I think my love for carnivals is something I'll never lose. I was like 9 or 10 when this happened, and I was a kind of nerdy kid growing up. In the days leading up to the spring carnival, I found myself in the library reading up on whatever I found interesting at the time. For whatever reason, I wound up in the history section. I remember the books being literally caked in layers of dust. That's how long it had been since they were even touched. I was flipping through a book on the history of our town when a small, faded slip of paper fell out from between the pages. Confused, I leaned down to pick it up. To my pleasant surprise, it was a ticket for our local spring carnival, dated over 15 years ago. The odds of something like that happening had to be extremely low. I was ecstatic. This ticket would make a great addition to my miscellaneous collection back home. What was even cooler, though, was the fact that the date on the ticket was just 2 days away, when the carnival would certainly be in town. As I predicted, the carnival cruised into town the next morning, so I figured, why not use the old ticket just for laughs, to see what the booth attendant would say. I wanted to get it punched anyway. The next evening, I headed to the carnival with the ticket safely tucked away in my pocket. As I approached the entrance, the carnival seemed just as lively as ever, the air filled with the scent of cotton candy and popcorn. I pulled out the ticket at the gate, handing it over to the guy at the booth. His face changed the moment he saw it. He went pale, his eyes widening slightly before he masked his reaction with a forced smile. It was honestly a little creepy. Enjoy your evening," he stammered, handing me back the ticket without punching it. I was so weirded out by his reaction that I forgot to ask him to punch it. I shrugged it off, though, thinking maybe he was just new and confused about the old design of the ticket. I wandered around, played some games, and enjoyed a funnel cake. The night was perfect, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I felt eyes on me, observing. Maybe it was just paranoia. I tried to ignore it at first, but I kept noticing the carnival employees giving me weird looks. After a while, I got fed up and decided to ask one of the older game operators about it. I found a kindly-looking elderly man running the ring toss booth. I showed him the ticket, and unlike the booth guy, he didn't even try to hide his shock. He glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "Young man, where did you get this?" he asked. After telling him where I found it, I started feeling uneasy about the whole situation. Maybe I should have just kept the ticket at home. "You found something you weren't meant to find," the old man started, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This ticket, it's part of a story that the folks around here don't talk about much. About 15 years ago, something terrible happened during the carnival right here in this town." He paused as if weighing whether to continue. "There was a young worker, name of Wynn, nice kid, everybody liked him. He was responsible for one of the rides. I can't remember which. One night, he just disappeared, vanished without a trace. The police found his wallet, but there was nothing in it except a ticket that looked an awful lot like this one," he said, gesturing towards my hands. The atmosphere around us seemed to drop a few degrees. He continued, "They searched everywhere, even drained the local pond, but no sign of him. After that, strange things started happening every time the carnival stopped here, accidents, things going missing, odd sightings. People said it was when trying to come back, or something worse that took him. I could feel a chill running down my spine, but a part of me was skeptical." "And you believe that?" I asked. The old man shrugged. "I've seen enough to keep an open mind. But the point is, the ticket you found might stir things up. It's best you get rid of it. Leave it here." He then motioned for me to give it to him, but I was reluctant. I looked down at it, reading it over again as if there was some kind of secret I was missing. How could a ticket be the cause of all that? I questioned, still not fully buying it. The look in his eye got darker, his tone switched almost as if he were angry. "Give it here," he told me, almost in a growl. I considered it but concluded that some stupid story wasn't worth giving up such a cool souvenir. I told him no, and he actually sprung up with a quickness that startled me. He reached for the ticket, his fingers grazing my hand. I jerked back instinctively, clutching the ticket tighter. The old man's expression morphed into something desperate, almost predatory. "You don't understand," he hissed, his eyes darting around as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the shadows. I backed away towards the tense exit, my heart pounding. "I think I should go," I stammered, turning to lose myself in the crowd. Behind me, I could hear his calls, a mix of pleading and warning. I didn't care what he was saying though. I let the bustling crowd around me drown his voice out. My mind was racing, not even about the ticket, but more so his aggressive reaction. The joy of the carnival had been spoiled. I left earlier than planned, the ticket burning a hole in my pocket. Over the next few days, my luck seemed to turn sharply. I missed catching the school bus, scraped my knee pretty bad in a bike accident, and worst of all, my best friend accused me of stealing his favorite baseball card, something I would never do. Things got worse than that, though. I remember coming home one night to my mother in tears after losing her job. My brother broke his leg skateboarding the next week, and our beloved family pet, Bean, also passed away a few days after that. It was like a dark cloud had settled over me since that night at the carnival. I couldn't help but remember the old man's warning about the ticket stirring things up. It seemed ridiculous, but then again, so was the string of bad luck that followed me. My dad laughed when I told him about my theory. He told me that there was no such thing as ghosts and that I shouldn't be so superstitious. One rainy afternoon after school, after a particularly tough day where I had forgotten my lunch and had to go hungry, I pulled the ticket out. I stared at it, this small piece of paper that had brought nothing but trouble. Feeling a mix of anger and fear, I decided I had had enough. I grabbed my raincoat and boots and trudged out to the creek that ran behind our house. My heart felt like it was pounding out of my chest as the rain soaked through my hair. Standing at the creek's edge, I took one last look at the ticket before tearing it into tiny pieces and watching them get swept up by the current. It's just a piece of paper, I thought. Things started to look up after that. My friend found his baseball card and apologized to me, and we became friends again. I didn't miss the bus a single time that school year. My mom got a better job in the next couple of days. Whether it was all a coincidence or that ticket really was cursed, I couldn't say, but one thing was for sure, I learned to be more careful about what I picked up and brought home. I don't believe in the supernatural, even after all this stuff happened to me. My parents liked telling me that I imagined everything because I was so young. It's still hard to fully explain it, but I've long since accepted it as one of those weird coincidences that you just can't explain. Our final story takes us to a desolate stretch of highway, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through a barren landscape. This is not a road frequented by travelers. The few gas stations that dotted its length had long since been abandoned, their pumps dry and their windows boarded up like hollow eyes staring out at the emptiness. A young couple, eager for a weekend getaway, found themselves stranded on this forgotten highway. Their car sputtered its last as the gas gauge hit empty. They had ignored the warning signs, the lack of other cars, the eerie silence that hung heavy in the air, too caught up in their own excitement to heed these signs. Now, they were stranded. The sun beat down on the cracked asphalt, the air thick with the smell of dust and despair. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. They were alone, utterly alone, in a place that felt forgotten by time. They decided to walk, hoping to find help, a glimmer of hope in this desolate landscape. Mile after mile, they walked, the sun beating down on them relentlessly. Their throats were parched, their energy draining with each step. The highway stretched out before them, an endless ribbon of asphalt leading nowhere. As they walked, they noticed something strange, cars abandoned on the roadside, seemingly frozen in time. Some were old and rusted, others surprisingly new, their paint still gleaming under the harsh sun. Each car was eerily empty, their interiors undisturbed, as if their occupants had vanished into thin air. Fear, primal and instinctive, began to creep into their hearts. The silence of the highway was no longer just unnerving, it was oppressive, heavy with an unseen menace. They quickened their pace, their eyes darting nervously at the abandoned vehicles, their minds conjuring up terrifying scenarios. As dusk approached, casting long eerie shadows across the highway, they stumbled upon a small town. Relief washed over them, a beacon of civilization in this desolate wasteland. But as they approached, their relief turned to horror. The town was deserted, buildings stood empty, their windows dark and lifeless. The streets were eerily silent, not a single soul in sight. It was as if the entire town had simply vanished, leaving behind an unsettling silence that spoke volumes. They pressed on, desperation fueling their steps, their senses on high alert and their hearts pounding in their chests. The town was like a ghost town, frozen in time, its silence amplifying their growing fear. As darkness fell, they came to a crossroads. In the fading light, they saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. Relief flooded them, a glimmer of hope in this desolate landscape. They called out, but the figure remained motionless, its back to them. As they drew closer, their hearts sank. The figure was a scarecrow, its straw-stuffed body dressed in tattered clothing, its painted face twisted into a grotesque grin. It was a cruel joke, a symbol of their isolation and despair. They collapsed on the roadside, their bodies spent, their spirits broken. They were trapped in a nightmare, a desolate highway populated by abandoned cars and ghost towns. Their hope, once a flickering flame, now threatened to be extinguished by overwhelming despair. Looks like there's a storm approaching. I glanced out the window of the car and looked behind us as my fiancée, Kiva, came out of the shop with a bag of snacks for our trip. The sky looked gray just a few feet behind us down the road. I heard low rumbling as Kiva opened the driver's side door and got in. "Do you think the roads will get bad?" I asked her. She glanced behind us for a few seconds before turning on the engine. The 80s station we had been listening to on our road trip turned on, and the music filled the car as Kiva pulled out of the gas station parking lot. "We can always pull over if they do," she replied. "Don't you think we should fill up on gas soon?" I asked. "I think we should be fine for now." I glanced over at the dashboard. "There's a quarter of a tank left," I noted. "Babe, it's fine. Trust me. You worry too much. Besides, that's more than a quarter." I sighed as I tried not to let it bug me. I hated getting lower than half a tank in my own car, it stressed me out to no end. We pulled out onto the road, and I grabbed my phone. As I opened the weather app, I looked at the forecast for the day, sunny with a high of 95. That couldn't be right. I made sure that I had cell service before opening the app again, thinking that maybe it would refresh. It didn't, and the forecast still said the same. "Huh," I said. "That's weird." "What's weird?" Kiva asked. I looked in the side mirror at the darkening skies behind me. The clouds were catching up to us quickly. Melanie, I glanced back at Kiva. The weather app says it's supposed to be sunny today. Maybe the app is down. Yeah, maybe, I replied. We continued down the road and stopped at a red light. I shifted in my seat so I could look behind us at the approaching storm. I could see the dark clouds moving across the sky, heading directly towards us. I turned back to face the road ahead of us when suddenly the sound of thunder boomed across the sky. I jumped as it was followed by a flash of lightning. All of a sudden, a scream erupted behind us. What was that? Kiva asked. Oh my God, what the? Someone yelled. The people in the cars around us began to roll down their windows to get a better view of whatever was happening. Kiva shifted the car into park and undid her seatbelt as she opened the door and stepped out of the car. I followed, walking between the traffic. As I followed Kiva, there was a crowd forming a few feet away where an old woman was crying and shouting nonsense. I looked up at the sky again and noticed that the gray clouds were even closer now, and I couldn't see anything in the distance anymore. I glanced back towards the car and then up at the traffic light, which was now green. No one was driving off yet, though, as everyone had gotten out of their cars to investigate. Suddenly, the loud sound of crushing metal caught my attention. As I looked towards the sound, a white pickup truck had been almost completely crushed. I squinted to get a closer look and noticed that there seemed to have been a person inside the truck when it was flattened, and their blood and insides covered the windshield. I looked away quickly as I took deep breaths, trying not to gag. Other people had started to walk toward the crushed truck, and some were gagging and backing up as they realized what they were seeing. What did? Someone screamed again. The sound of crushing metal was heard, and a second car had been crushed. This time, it had only been the hood of the car that had been crushed, and the driver ran out to look at the damage. Get back in your cars now, someone screamed. I locked eyes with Kiva, and we ran to the car, getting in and slamming the doors shut. As Kiva shifted back into drive and managed to pull in between the cars and speed through the intersection, I kept looking behind us as the clouds continued to approach. I could see raindrops now. Some of the people had made it away just in time, and others got caught in the rain. The sound of multiple cars being crushed filled the street as Kiva sped down the road. Luckily for us, it was mainly empty. I held on to the armrest as Kiva kept speeding. Is that the rain doing that? I asked, glancing back again. I think so, Kiva muttered. She continued to drive, hyper-focused on the road. I glanced over at the speedometer. She was going almost 90. I looked over at the side of the road as we passed a speed limit sign but said nothing. I looked back at the approaching storm. The rain had picked up excessively, and all of the trees and stop lights had been crushed. They were now crumpled up in the middle of the road, blocking anyone else from escaping the storm. As I glanced down in the rearview mirror, I noticed that most of the road was gone too. There were giant holes everywhere, making it impossible to drive on. My body flung forward as Kiva hit the brakes. All of a sudden, the sound of the screeching brakes and the tires on the road filled my ears as she tried to stop the car. She exclaimed, and the car finally came to a stop. I looked over at her. Why are you stopping? She motioned towards the road where there was a giant tree branch blocking the way. Help me move it, hurry. I jumped out of the car and helped her push the branch out of the way. As we pushed, I couldn't help but glance toward the storm, which was still rapidly approaching. The rain was also picking up, and it seemed like we were right, the rain was to blame. I used all my strength to push on the branch as Kiva pulled, and we finally got it out of the way. We ran back to the car and I glanced back to see the rain approaching. As the first drop of rain landed on the roof of a small convenience store on the side of the road, it all crumbled to the ground. I slid into the seat of the car. "What do you think happens if it lands on someone?" I asked. Kiva turned to look at me. She opened her mouth to speak but didn't get to, as she glanced out one of the back windows. I followed her gaze and saw a man walking down the side of the road. In a split second, the rain caught up. 1 second he was there, and the next second, there was a splatter of blood and human insides on the sidewalk. "I guess that's your answer," Kiva said as she started driving again. I turned around in my seat to keep an eye on the storm. It seemed that the winds had started to pick up, and I could hear them whistling as Kiva continued to drive. "It's getting faster," I replied. She said nothing, but I could feel the speed of the car picking up. We'd been on the road for about half an hour now, and the storm seemed to consistently pick up speed with each second that passed. I couldn't stop myself from looking back at the approaching storm and all of the damage that the rain had done. We'd seen it crush a few more people as it passed through. I don't know how long this storm is going to last or how far out it's going to travel, I thought. But I'm hoping that I can at least warn a few people. Maybe you can make a plan to outrun it. We're going to run out of gas soon, and there's no way that we would have enough time to stop and fill up on gas without the storm catching up to us and crushing our car, and then us. I don't know what we're going to do. We haven't even passed another car that we could potentially steal to try to outrun the storm. I don't know if anyone will even see this or how this will even help, but if you start to see the storm approaching, start running. We started in New Jersey, where we're from, and made our way west. It was a great time. We saw stuff that we always talked about seeing. After day 3, we finally hit the dreaded boring part of the drive, Nebraska. Nothing but cornfields as far as the eye can see. It was about 6:30 p.m., and the sun was starting to set. I looked at the gas gauge, and it read 1/4 of a tank. I told my buddy we should start looking for a gas station. He checked the GPS, and nothing for at least 100 miles showed up. I started to get nervous because the last thing we need is to run out of gas in the middle of Nebraska with literally nothing around at night. That's how horror movies start. Finally, as we crested a small hill, my fears, at least for the time being, were put to rest. Down the road, maybe half a mile, we saw a blue sign that said, "Gas next exit." Little did I know that the next exit was another 30 miles away. So we drove and drove, all the while with one eye on the gauge. Finally, we saw the exit and got off. The gas light on the dashboard came on, warning us we had less than a gallon left. The sign pointed to the right at the end of the exit ramp and said 10 miles gas. The car we were driving was a 200 Ford Explorer. Being an old SUV, I knew it barely got 14 miles to the gallon on a good day. I shared a look with my friend. We both shrugged. I made the turn, and we continued on. The sun had now gone down, and for those of you who have never been to the Midwest at night, it's not like being in the city. When the sun goes down, there is no ambient light whatsoever. No street lights, no lights from a major city giving off the comfortable orange glow, nothing. Just an endless darkness in all directions. Even the highway offered no lights. I turned on the high beams and could barely see 50 feet in front of me. My spider sense was tingling at this point, but we pressed on. What other choice did we have? Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. I kept my eyes peeled for any possible animals that might dart out in front of me. Suddenly, the car started to shudder. My friend and I both shared an, "Oh, look," as we started going up another hill. The car barely made it up and crested the hill. As we did, we saw our salvation, lights from a gas station. If I had only known what was going to happen next, I would have gotten out of the car and run back to the interstate. We rolled down the hill and entered what I can only describe as a ghost town. There were buildings, shops, and houses, every single one of them boarded up. There was one exception, a church set opposite the station. One of those old ones you would usually see in New York or Paris. It appeared to be sandstone with a huge steeple. It looked like it was brand new, with a nicely manicured lawn and a huge red wooden door. The stained glass windows that lined the outside had pictures telling a story. However, instead of telling the story of the Stations of the Cross or the Virgin Mary, as most churches had, these showed depictions of people burning in fire, their faces twisted in agony under the cloven hoof of what I could only think was the devil. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something here just didn't feel right. The car died about 500 feet from the gas station, so we got out and pushed it the rest of the way. As we got out, I heard something barely audible, almost like a humming, coming from the church. My buddy didn't hear anything, so I assumed I must just be tired. The pump was new, with one of the credit card readers. Which struck me as odd, considering everything else in this town, save the church, looked like it hadn't had anyone living in it for at least 30 years. We filled up without incident, and as we finished, the sound, which now sounded like a humming droning, got louder. We got back into the car and left. The road we came in on was a one-way, so the only way out was to go further into the town and hopefully find a road that led back to the interstate. As we drove, we saw more light being reflected off the buildings. We pulled into a town square where there was a huge stage and hundreds of chairs set up for what looked like a concert of some sort. The light was coming from a bonfire in the center of the audience area. As we pulled further into the square, we could see a guy playing music for no one. There wasn't one person in any of the seats. I used to work in the music industry. I know a sound check when I see one. Usually, that happens before the concert, so a musician can check his or her sound with the guy running the soundboard. With no one around, this was not it. He was covered in sweat, screaming his music and playing almost like his life depended on it. We came to a T intersection and a stop sign. We had the windows down because it was summer and we were trying to save gas by not using the AC. The droning humming I heard had gotten louder. It was almost like it was in my head, beating my brain. Now it sounded like it was coming from the buildings themselves. It got louder and louder. The guy playing music screamed even louder, almost like he was fighting the sound. Then a whole lot of things happened at once. The humming reached fever pitch and then stopped abruptly. The bonfire went out. The guy on stage stopped playing. Down on the right of the road, which looked like it was the only way back to the highway, came a mob of people with pitchforks, boards, rocks, and one guy had what looked like a samurai sword. Looking back now, I remember thinking it strange that no one had a gun considering where we were. They came running towards us, screaming and waving their weapons. My buddy and I covered our heads in anticipation of the beating of our lives. They started pounding on the car, even going so far as to break one of the little windows in the back seat. I threw the car in four-wheel drive and slammed the accelerator. The car lurched forward, plastering a few people onto the windshield, but ultimately we broke through the mob. The ones who weren't knocked down from the impact of the car started storming the stage. They jumped onto it and started assaulting the musician with their weapons, his screams echoing off the derelict buildings. I didn't waste any time. I slammed on the gas pedal, cut the wheel, and sped out down the road to the right, the whole time with my friend screaming obscenities. We got back to the highway and drove for another 30 miles until we hit our destination for the night, where our hotel was. We got into our room, trying to make sense of what we had just seen. As I put my bags down, I looked at my friend and he looked at me. We both agreed to go to the police in the morning, as it was now about 3 a.m. The next day, we woke up, packed our overnight bags, and went out to our car. We immediately drove to the police department and asked to speak to a detective, as we had a crime to report. A small bald man from a desk stood up and invited us to come and sit with him. We then proceeded to tell him the whole thing. When we were finished, he asked us, pale as a ghost, "Did you tell anyone else this?" We, of course, responded in the negative, to which he replied, "Good. Keep it that way." With his hands shaking, he showed us the door, and we left. We never spoke of it to anyone else. Immersed between the pines, that was the predicament I currently ended up in, an empty highway spanning miles and miles through one of the most desolate roads in the Rocky Mountains. How long had it been since I was at Jim's diner, looking at the sky gray and foreboding, obvious that a storm was on the horizon. There was that smell in the air, sulfur, between the heat of the afternoon and the sudden chill. I could even feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. Trapped on this highway, with no exit for 40 miles, no car or truck for at least 2 hours, and my bike broken down. Wonderful, I muttered, exasperated. Could today get any worse? I had run out of gas. There were some farmlands a few miles back, lost to the oncoming darkness and surrounding sea of pines. The odd feeling, beyond the sense of being completely alone, was that of truly being alone. No chirp or buzz, even howling, that would animate these mountains, beyond the roar of tires and horns, like life itself had found residence elsewhere, leaving me in this impersonation of the world I once was in. Climbing up the hill, feeling the first drops of rain hitting my leather jacket, I felt the first tinge of fear. Until the end of the hill, I saw an exit, plain as day. The name of the town was Padua, the other name was scribbled out. Padua, I thought. Beggars can't be choosers. The walk didn't take as long as I expected it would. The cut into the pines led to a town trapped in another time. Not a ghost town from the last century with broken-down ranches and general stores, but a town that looked like a postcard from the 50s. That retro look was long associated with the big bop monster movies and drive-in theaters. There was only one problem with the site: not a single soul, nor a single car, was moving throughout the town. Instead, there was only the same silence I had heard throughout the mountain highway. There wasn't much more to think about. I resolved to explore the town as it started to come more into view with each step and push. There was a gas station not too far away, a diner down the block, and, from the looks of it, a hotel in the center between the two. I should name this town Lucky Break. "Hello," I called out, standing at the gas station, my bike parked at a stall. No dust, the pumps were on but locked. Walking into the store, which was open, the lights flickered almost as a response. Anyone here? The store was completely packed full of food and drinks, just no worker. Maybe he's on break, I muttered to myself, trying not to dissect the logic any further. I grabbed a protein bar and a bottle of water. It was still cold and fresh to the touch. There was a feeling that I was being watched. Maybe it was just the eerie feeling of being alone. As the doors shut behind me, I could have sworn I saw a shadow sitting at the register. When I did a double take, I found the store completely empty. Drinking the water and chewing on the bar, it had been hours since I had eaten or drunk anything. I released the trigger to let the gas pump start. There wasn't any other way I knew how to get it to work, no credit card slot, no manual pump on the outside. Must be an older job. When I finished filling up the bike, I took in the scenery and watched the clouds. The bike came to life, and I looked around, still feeling that sense of not being alone. "Oh well," I spoke aloud as I entered the empty street. I decided that, while it was only slightly drizzling, I might as well explore the town. Spanning only a few blocks, lights were on in most buildings. However, there wasn't a sign of a single human, animal, or even insect. Like a model or a set of a movie left alone, tomorrow they'd come back and start again. There were a few buildings I tried. I needed a bathroom anyway. A few cloth shops, nothing that I needed or wanted. Being on a bike limits what can be carried. Then there was a library, stacked with books. There was a theme I noticed, not thanks to the books, but the periodicals. Nothing past the date of 1958. That didn't make sense. The last article read about the local football team going off to take the championship on October 21st. What happened October 22nd? There was too much to think about. The only thing that mattered was finding shelter and maybe getting a proper dinner. In all this commotion, I realized leaving the library that I still hadn't charged my phone. What was I thinking? Finding the diner I had passed before, the setup was one of those tube-like buildings that used to populate the country, slowly disappearing one by one to make way for franchises. Hello, I left my bike in the parking lot. The rain started to pick up, nothing hard yet, but it was coming soon. Again, I began to wonder why I would even ask. At this point, I'm just going to let myself in. I found a place for my phone to charge. The outlet looked a little weird, but it fit. When the screen came on, I could have guessed as much, no signal. Looking around the empty diner with its colorful booths, counter cakes in the displays, the grill in the back, even a jukebox and cigarette dispenser, I walked up, placing a few loose quarters in both. I found myself putting "Jingle Jingle Jingle" on the jukebox, a cigarette hanging out of my mouth. I checked the back room, the grills all worked and even the ovens. Playing with the switches, I found myself even dancing to antiquated songs, singing with a sparse knowledge of the lyrics. There was a fridge full of vegetables, red meat, even a steak. Putting the steak on, I heard "The End of the World" by Skeeter Davis starting to play. The eerie song almost put the sound of complete silence in perspective. When I was 29 years old, I'd saved enough money to buy my first house. It wasn't anything special, and honestly, all things considered, it wasn't in the best neighborhood either. But I was still proud of the accomplishment nonetheless. I'd met all the nearby neighbors within the first 2 weeks I moved in. Considering the neighborhood, I was surprised to discover they all actually seemed pretty nice. A couple of them even invited me over for dinner a few times, and having lived in different apartments all my life, this wasn't really something I was used to. Of course, they weren't all like this. However, 2 houses down from the house I moved into lived a man that was probably 50 years old. Upon moving in, every other night or so, the dude would knock at my front door at some absurd hour asking for stuff. For example, the first time it happened, he asked me to find any spare bread I wasn't going to eat. Another time, he asked me if I could fill up a bucket with water because his was turned off. It was just random but somewhat understandable things like that. But I drew the line when he started asking me for money. I figured I had no obligation to be constantly meeting this guy's needs. I mean, I had pretty much just met the dude. I started opening the door to his knocks less and less, but this didn't seem to have any effect on the number of times he would show up. Fast forward to a night a few weeks later, and again, another knock. I planned to ignore it like I'd grown accustomed to doing by that point, but as I looked through the peephole, I noticed the guy looked distressed. Seeing this, I decided the right thing to do would be to open up the door. So I did. I asked him what he needed, and what he responded with was not at all the type of response I was expecting. He asked me if I could come over and show him how to use his new grill. Now, this happened around midnight, which in my opinion was an extremely odd time to start grilling. But against my better judgment, I decided I would help him. I was pretty into cooking at that point in my life and figured taking 10 minutes to show the guy how a grill worked wouldn't be the end of the world. I told him that I'd be over in a second and that I just needed to put some shoes on. He thanked me and started walking back. A couple of minutes later, I made my way over to his house. I opened some gate and walked into his backyard. It was dark, so it was hard to see, but it was clear there was no grill. On top of that, the guy was nowhere in sight, although his back door was wide open. I stuck my head inside and yelled out for the guy. "Yeah, I'm down here. I need your help getting some meat from the freezer." The muffled response came from down a set of stairs just to the left of me. I was hesitant to go down. There were no lights on down there. In fact, there wasn't a single light on throughout the whole house. I yelled down the stairs, asking him if he could turn on a light so I could see. There was silence for a few seconds. Eventually, he responded, "No, they're broken. I can't do that." I knew something was off at that point. I yelled back something like, "I think I'm just gonna go, man." I kid you not, the second after I said this, audible footsteps started sprinting up the stairs. My flight reaction kicked in immediately. I ran directly back to my house and locked the door behind me. I pulled back a set of curtains and looked out one of my windows, but I didn't see anything. I was terrified. I thought about calling the police, but decided against it, figuring I really wouldn't be able to prove anything that just happened. For the next few days, I didn't leave my house for anything except work. During those days, I never saw the guy nor did any late-night knocks occur. Exactly 1 week after it happened, I was talking with my neighbor across the street. The conversation eventually landed on what I experienced and how I was planning to move because of it. But I was just met with a look of confusion. I was then informed that no one lived in the house I was talking about. It had been abandoned for 2 years. This prompted my neighbor to call the police. However, the police would find nothing inside or around the house. I moved out a few weeks later, so that's all I know. I'm not sure if anything else came from the situation or not. I still don't know who that guy was or what he was trying to lure me into. This experience happened to me when I was only 9 years old. Being that it was so long ago, I don't remember every small detail, but I'll do my best to keep everything as accurate as possible. Back then, I lived in a considerably remote area in the U.S. Neighboring houses were a good half-mile apart. Therefore, while my family had met a couple of our neighbors, many of them were complete strangers. This included the resident of the house to the left of ours. I don't remember his name, but it was an elderly man that lived there. He was creepy, to say the least. All of the windows on his house were spray-painted so that no one could see inside, and his whole yard was completely overgrown. I know all this because every Monday through Friday, I had to walk past his house to get home from school. Every time I did this, the man would either be standing on his porch watching me or trying to make conversation with me as I walked by. It got to the point where I dreaded walking home from school just because I'd have to walk past him. But this wasn't even the worst of it. Maybe once or twice a month, the guy would make the half-mile walk to our house in the middle of the night. He would then shine a flashlight into the window of my room. I knew it was the same guy too because one of the times, I witnessed him walking down the road towards our house. Looking back, this was 100% extremely alarming behavior, but at the time, I thought the best way of handling it was just to ignore it. Therefore, I didn't tell my parents about it. I also remember reasoning that my bedroom was on the second floor, so it's not like he was able to see much of inside my room anyway. Skip to a summer night in that same year, and I was once again woken up by the light of a flashlight shining in my room. This time, it was followed by a subtle thud sound against the wall. It felt like my heart had stopped. The only thing running through my mind in that moment was how it sounded exactly like a ladder being propped up against the side of the house. Not long later, my suspicions would be confirmed. A knocking sound rang out from the glass of the window. I looked over and was met with the smiling face of the man gesturing me to open the window. But no. I screamed and ran to my parents' bedroom. I desperately explained to them how the neighbor was outside my window. They went in my room, but of course, he was gone by that point. The worst part is they didn't even believe me, chalking it up to me seeing things. Therefore, the police were never called. But even now, as an adult, I know exactly what I saw. I try not to think about the intentions he had towards my 9-year-old self. I never saw him again after that. In fact, not even a week after the occurrence, his house had a for sale sign up next to it, which to me serves as further proof that it was him. I've lived in many different places since then, and not one neighbor comes even slightly close to how creepy that man was. My 2 kids, Audrey and Radley, are twins. They're 6 years old. A year ago, we were living at our old house, but something happened that led to us moving. It's a long, awful story. I lived in my old house for 4 years. My wife Louisa and I got married while I was living there, and we had our kids there too. The neighborhood was slowly changing, and not for the better, but even still, we originally planned on staying in that house for the foreseeable future until this happened. We were a corner house, and the house behind us on the intersecting road was covered by a bunch of tall trees and bushes, so we hardly ever saw those neighbors. Our neighbor on the right, however, his name was Farley, had just moved there less than a year ago. At the time, I had only ever spoken with him a couple of times. Both times I could hardly understand what he said because of his heavy accent, and he just overall didn't seem like the friendliest guy. 2 of his windows overlooked our backyard. There wasn't much privacy, but whatever rooms the 2 windows were that overlooked the backyard, I had never seen the lights on in either of them. So I always assumed it was an unused guest room or something of that nature. One day in the summertime, Audrey and Radley were playing in the backyard in their blow-up pool and with their water guns while I was outside doing yard work. There came a certain point where I was walking towards the detached garage, and then I saw Farley next door at his window. For a second, only half a second after noticing him, did he turn and walk away from the window. It was slightly odd for sure, but I left it alone. Later that day, as the sun was going down, the kids went back outside to play again. It was a very hot day, so they went back in their blow-up pool while Louisa and I were in the kitchen as she was making dinner. Then the kids' laughter went quiet for a while, and suddenly Radley came inside and said there was a flashing light from the neighbor's window. I had to follow him into the backyard to ask him to show me what he was talking about. He pointed to one of Farley's upstairs windows that overlooked the backyard, and he said there was a white light that kept coming from that window. I immediately assumed the worst and asked the twins if it looked like a camera flash. They both said yes. I told them it was time to dry off and come inside. So I helped them dry themselves and then brought them in where I went to tell Louisa about this. She immediately assumed the worst, just like me. She said I should go next door and knock on Farley's door. So I did, but when I did, he never answered the door. His car was even in the driveway, so he had to be home. After a few attempts at knocking and ringing the bell, I gave up and went back to my house. I told Louisa he wasn't opening up, which made what the kids said seem even more credible. While we couldn't prove that the white light the kids were seeing was a camera flash, it sure did sound like it, and it was concerning to hear. Some time passed, maybe even weeks, before one night when Louisa and I were in the bedroom, we heard our side gate being quietly opened and closed outside. Louisa wanted me to go check outside, so I stepped out into the backyard and looked around. I had on all the lights as I searched. I found nothing and nobody, but I noticed the lights in Farley's backyard were on. I went over to look over the fence into his yard, and I nearly jumped out of my skin when he came up to the fence from the other side and asked if I needed something. I asked him if he'd seen or heard anyone sneaking through our yard. He said no. I took this time to also ask him bluntly if he had, by chance, been watching my kids, as they thought someone was at his window taking pictures of them playing in the pool. His reaction to this was a bit suspicious. He acted overly offended to my asking this, almost yelling at me for such an accusation. Again, without proof, I couldn't, nor did I want to, start issues with a neighbor. I apologized and went back inside. Louisa was not happy about this, saying he's full of it. The next incident didn't happen until another few weeks later. This time it was in the middle of the night when we were asleep. I woke up to Louisa shaking me in a panic. I looked around the room, confused at first, but then when I heard the kids screaming from their room, I exploded from the bed and ran downstairs to the kids' room. Radley was awake and crying, and I found out a few seconds later that his crying and screaming had awoken Audrey, who was crying and screaming in reaction to him. Radley said there was someone outside the window a second ago, and there was a camera flash from the window. I got goosebumps, but I also felt my blood begin to boil. All I could say was, "What did he look like?" He said he didn't see. I brought the kids up to our room to sleep in the bed with us. With the lights off, I peeked out our bedroom window to look across at Farley's unlit house next door. I looked at each window of his house, and I found him. He, just like me, was peeking out one of the upstairs windows in that same room that overlooks the backyard. I stormed outside next door and rang his doorbell like 15 times. He never opened his door. I did call the police just to make a report on Farley. That way, if any future reports were made about him from other people, maybe the police department would look into him. I never saw him again. Sometimes I'd sit out front, waiting to see him outside, but he'd clearly avoid coming outside when I'd be out there. Because of this, we ended up moving within a month to a new house in a different but nearby town, which has proven to be a better place to raise the kids anyway. This happened to me last summer when I was 23. I wasn't a very outgoing kid at the time. If I ever did anything social, it was because my degenerate friends had somehow dragged me out of the house. This was one of those times, well, it was supposed to be. My friend Ralph invited me to a house party at like 8 p.m. It was pretty spontaneous, but I had nothing going on, so I reluctantly agreed to go with him. I knew he was going to give me crap if I refused. I can't even lie, though, the idea of a party, even with strangers, sounded more appealing than being alone. Ralph was a few towns over from me, so it made more sense for us to drive separately instead of going together. He gave me the address, and I was on my way. The literal second I pulled onto the street, Ralph bailed at the last minute. Rightfully so, I was super frustrated. How could he bail on me like this? There I was, feeling like a complete idiot outside a stranger's house. Annoyed but determined not to waste the night, I decided to go in. I drove all the way here, I thought. Might as well go inside. I walked up the front steps and knocked on the door. The host, Crispin, greeted me warmly. He was instantly likable, charismatic and friendly without being a douchebag. He introduced me around, and things were actually less awkward than I had anticipated. People were really friendly to me despite not knowing who I was. There were even a few girls I had my eyes on. I decided to enjoy the party and hit the booze hard. It was getting pretty late, but the party was still raging. Admittedly, I might have overdone it with the drinking. At one point, I was so nauseous and dizzy that I needed a break. It must have been close to 3 a.m. at that point. I went upstairs to look for a bathroom, but they were all occupied. The house was deceptively big. Granted, it was probably the alcohol, but I was literally getting lost stumbling through the maze of hallways up there. After making it to the top floor, I found a door leading to what seemed like an attic or storage room. Desperate for privacy, I figured it was as good a place as any to pull myself together. I groped around blindly for the light switch, but there was none. This was definitely an attic or something, as there was also dust everywhere. There was a window in the far corner, which I opened, allowing the cool night breeze to wash over me. There was a solid minute there where I was seriously considering throwing up onto the roof. The breeze somewhat cured my nausea, though, so I just kept my head hung out of the window. It was dark outside, and the quiet was a refreshing contrast to the boisterous chaos downstairs. Sometimes all you need to restore your state of mind is a gentle breeze and some peace and quiet. Just as I was about to close the window and head back, I heard a faint noise, footsteps on the roof shingles. That didn't make any sense, though. Was I going crazy? Curious, I climbed out onto the roof. In all honesty, there was probably a 0% chance I would have done that if I had been sober. I slowly stood up and looked around. In the moonlight, I saw something terrifying. There were two masked figures with bags emerging from another window. It dawned on me, Crispin's house was being robbed. I started panicking. Should I shout? Confront them? Then a more pressing question hit me. What if they were armed? In my clumsy state of disbelief, I slipped and scuffed one of the shingles pretty loudly. One of the burglars heard it and jolted his head in my direction. Our eyes briefly met, and I froze. He nudged his partner, and the two of them quickly started making their way across the roof. Adrenaline surged through me. I couldn't let them get away. Crispin had been so welcoming, and I felt a surge of loyalty. I decided to act. I quietly followed the burglars across the roof, keeping a safe distance. They headed towards a sloping part of the roof for an easier escape. As they climbed down, I pulled out my phone to dial 911 but fumbled in my drunken state, dropping it. The phone clattered loudly, and the burglar turned sharply. "Who's there?" one of them hissed. Heart pounding, I ducked and scanned my surroundings, spotting a loose roof shingle. Without thinking, I grabbed it and hurled it towards them. It missed, but the noise startled them, causing one to lose his footing. He tumbled down the roof, crashing into the gutter before falling to the ground. The other burglar, now panicked, leaped to a neighboring tree and scrambled down. I rushed to the edge of the roof and saw the fallen burglar groaning on the ground. I needed to alert everyone. As I turned to head back, I heard sirens. Someone else must have called the cops. I stumbled back into the attic room and made my way downstairs, trying to appear calm. The party was still in full swing, oblivious to the drama outside. I found Crispin laughing and chatting with guests. "Crispin, you need to call the police. There's been a robbery." "I saw the burglar on the roof," I said. Crispin's face turned from amusement to shock. "Are you serious?" he said as he hurried to make the call. I explained what happened. The party mood shifted from celebration to concern. Apparently, one of Crispin's neighbors had coincidentally already called the police to file a noise complaint, which was an incredibly ironic turn of good fortune. When they arrived, I recounted my story, leading them to the injured burglar. The man was arrested, but his partner had fled. The party ended abruptly. People started scattering, and the lights got flipped on. I tried my best to act sober, but even after all that happened, I was still stumbling a bit. Crispin thanked me profusely, still in disbelief. As for me, I was just glad I could help despite the bizarre and terrifying circumstances. Looking back, I still can't really explain why the burglars would have chosen a house having a party to rob, but maybe they had prior knowledge of the house and knew no one would be upstairs. I figured that would be the end of the story, but fast forward a few months, and I've got quite the update. I was playing video games at Ralph's house one night when he got a call from Crispin, who invited us over for a few beers. Up until that point, I hadn't actually realized the two of them were that close. The first thing I noticed when I pulled up to Crispin's house was that the front door and every window in sight were completely different. Was I not remembering his house right? I could have sworn the windows and the front door had been white, but they were all gray and much more heavy-duty looking. Crispin waved us in, and we went down to his basement. We cracked a few beers and started playing a game of pool. To my surprise, he actually recognized me from the party and thanked me again for my trouble. What he told us was actually crazy, though. Apparently, the burglar the police caught that night refused to snitch on his partner and was currently serving a lengthy prison sentence. The police hadn't been able to get any leads into catching the other guy, though. Crispin told us that not even a week after the incident, his family started receiving threatening letters from an unknown sender, some of which included pictures of Crispin and his family members. Obviously, they reported these occurrences, but the police had no real leads. A month after that, Crispin's mom noticed a suspicious vehicle circling the house at around 1 a.m., and a few days later, Crispin's dad claimed that things in their backyard had been gone through and moved around. In response, Crispin's dad increased their home security and even went as far as to replace and reinforce all their doors and windows. I was shocked. This was still an ongoing issue for Crispin, and I had no idea how serious a situation like this could get. Summer's fast approaching, and I'm sure I'll have another update when I see Crispin again. I'm a cemetery operations coordinator, or you can just call me a cemetery manager. Part of my job is sitting down with guests and family members of the deceased to set up funerals, facilitate the sales of plots. A 30-something-year-old man named Claude, a very spiritual man, once sat down with me to purchase a plot for his sick father who was in hospice care. Claude was a Hispanic man with a very thick accent, and I saw in his eyes he was a very caring man. He showed me pictures of his father, who also looked like a very sweet man, much too young to be taken away from his family. Unfortunately, the man's time came that same week, and Claude arranged for his father's funeral service at the cemetery. It was a very stormy day, the day of the funeral, which is thought to be a sign of good luck. The funeral procession stopped in front of the front office building briefly. I stepped outside under the front awning of the building and saw Claude in the car behind the hearse. We waved at each other. Due to the weather, I went back inside until the procession was ready to proceed to the burial site. I got in one of the cemetery pickup trucks and followed the procession to the final stop where I would stand with my umbrella, supervising, as part of my job is making sure funeral services go smoothly. After the funeral, I did some laps around the place in the truck just to survey the area, as I did at least a couple times a day. I had a lot of paperwork to take care of, and on top of this, I had to close the cemetery that night. So, a little later, I went back to my desk and took care of this. The cemetery closes at 5:30, so as soon as it started to get dark, I drove around the place one more time to ensure all visitors had left, then drove over to the front gate to shut it. It was a relatively warm early March. The days were still on the shorter side, so by closing time on a normal day, it would already be getting darker, but on this stormy day, it already felt like it was nighttime. I was driving back to my office when I thought I saw someone hurriedly walking down one of the lanes of tombstones before turning behind a hedge and disappearing out of sight. I beeped my horn to let them know the place was closed, but strangely enough, I didn't see them again. I grabbed my umbrella and ran out into the rain in that direction. I turned beyond the hedge they turned at and looked down this long row of tombstones on one side and hedges on the other. I didn't see anyone. I looked around in the rain for a solid 20 minutes, but eventually, I had to give up. I drove back up to the office and browsed through the CCTV footage. None of it picked up any unusual movement, even though it was a bit harder to see much because of the storm, and it was also pitch black outside now. I tried to multitask, keeping an eye on the camera while finishing up some of my paperwork, when I heard the front door to the visitation room slammed shut. I sprang up from my chair and yelled, "Hello." My first thought was that it was the same person I saw before. Maybe they got locked in the cemetery and were looking for assistance in leaving. I stepped out into the lobby, but no one was there. I looked around and again said, "Hello." Maybe the door slamming shut was them leaving. I started looking out all the windows, and I stopped when, through one of them, I saw someone on the other side looking back at me with a blank expression. I jumped back and screamed, and they didn't flinch. I stepped closer and made a squinty-eyed, confused look when I realized I recognized this Hispanic older-looking man. In my head, it reminded me exactly of the pictures of Claude's father he showed me. With my heart in my throat, I ran out the front door of the building and to the side where I saw the man, but he was gone. He wasn't booking it into the fields, he wasn't hiding in a bush nearby, he was gone. I looked around me as I stood in the rain getting soaked, then ran back inside, packed up my things, locked up, and got in my car. I opened and closed the gate once more, locking it behind me, and drove home. When my wife asked me at home why I was being so quiet, I just told her it was a long day at work. To this day, I think I was just overworking myself, and my mind was playing tricks on me, but it still is genuinely disturbing to think about. I work at a cemetery on the edge of my town. It's a small one, being only a few acres of land. I'd been working there for a year at the time, and I hated every minute of it. Not really because it was a cemetery, but just because it was boring. I was alone all night and sat in a small room for most of the time. There were 2 cameras set up on either side of the yard and one on the entrance of the tiny building I was in. My boss always told me that my job was to just be there, and if anything actually happens, then to call the police and let them take care of it. In the whole year before this, not a single thing happened. Again, it was a small cemetery in a small town, so not a lot of action was expected. On a Monday evening, I pulled into the parking lot and relieved my coworker from his day shift. I hadn't slept the best that day, so I brought a cup of coffee to help keep me up. For the first hour, I was sipping on my coffee and watching the cameras while also scrolling through my phone a bit. Come 1 a.m., I started to get really drowsy. I was nodding off in my chair, and the coffee wasn't really helping either. In the middle of the hour, I guess I fully fell asleep. What I think was 20 or so minutes later, I woke up to an odd sound, metal creaking behind me. I swiveled around in my chair. The door to my building was cracked open, swaying slightly from the wind outside. My heart hurt from the strike of fear it gave me. I got up and pulled the door further open, peeking my head outside and looking around. Nobody was in sight. I slammed the door firmly shut and made sure it was fully locked. It could have been a simple mistake, not fully closing the door, but it got my hair standing up. I rolled back the footage outside the building and didn't see anyone coming up to the building. At least after this, I was wide awake. I was constantly checking each camera. About 10 minutes later, I saw something move on the screen. It was the camera on the far end of the yard. Someone was walking through the cemetery. I watched as they slowly made their way past several gravestones, then stopped. I waited a few seconds before picking up the phone and dialing 911, still keeping my eyes on the screen. I spoke softly into the phone, telling the operator that I worked at the cemetery and there was a man trespassing. The woman on the phone started responding when suddenly the man sprinted through the yard and off of the screen. I let out an uncontrollable gasp, moving my eyes all around the other cameras looking for him. A second later, he appeared on the other screen, sprinting past it again, and not long after, he appeared on the screen showing the outside of the building I was in. I told the woman what was going on, that I needed to be quiet. I put the phone down and stared at the camera. It was a man who was now standing right outside the door. Then he looked around at the face of the building before locking his eyes on the camera. It made me shiver, seeing him stare at the camera as if he could see me through the screen. "Hello. Can you help me?" I heard his muffled voice from the other side of the door. Then, without even waiting for an answer, he walked around to the back of the building. There were no cameras on that side, but I could hear his footsteps in the grass. He sounded like he was walking right up against the wall. Then out of nowhere, I heard his footsteps departing quickly. My heart was racing all the way up until the police came. I thought I'd sound crazy, but they found very defined shoe prints in the grass. They followed them far off, way past the cemetery border, but lost the trail before it led anywhere else. The man's behavior was very odd, and the way he asked for help was even odder. I don't know if the door being opened earlier was somehow him, but I don't know what to believe anymore. Despite being scared shitless, I continued working and still work there. Nothing else has happened, and the man never returned, but I don't think I'll ever fall asleep at the cemetery again. I work in the pro department of a home improvement company. I worked the closing shift with another cashier, who I'll call Aria. Aria's a really kind but quite timid cashier. She's also very pretty, so she has a lot of contractors hit on her. It's usually not that worrisome, though a few compliments, maybe a dinner invite, which she'd politely decline. I would probably ask her out as well if it wasn't for one detail: Aria does have a girlfriend. So being hit on by guys on a daily basis makes her rather uncomfortable. When we first met, I told her she ought to tell those guys about being gay, but she kept saying it wasn't any of their business, so she kept that part to herself. Aria has become my best friend, and having another cashier there with you keeps things from getting lonely. We even cover for each other's lunch breaks. One day, when I came back from lunch, Aria started telling me about this rather creepy guy who was flirting with her. She said she politely turned him down, saying she was with someone already, and while he didn't seem happy, he did leave. I shrugged it off as nothing more than the usual horny guy and laughed it off. But later that day, the man came back. Aria wasn't there, as she had left to help a customer find some lumber, so it was just me. He looked rather normal, probably handsome to most women, but he acted off. After looking around the area, I asked him if I could help him with anything. "I'm here to see Aria," he told me. I asked him how he knew her, and he said he had come in earlier and asked her out, to which she said yes, so he had come back in to pick her up. I told him she had left for the day, a usual lie everyone tells to cover for their friends. His smile went away as he started looking annoyed. He said he wanted to speak to Aria and ask her out again, which contradicted what he had just told me about accepting his previous invite. I told him he could not do that, which caused him to cross his arms and asked me why not. I'm not the best liar when it comes to making up excuses on the spot. However, I didn't want to tell him Aria was gay if she didn't want him to know it. So I just blurted out that Aria was my fiancée. His annoyed look went to confusion as he asked me how someone as pretty as she is could go out with someone like me. I'm not a Chris Evans for anything, but I don't think I'm that bad looking. I told him it didn't matter and that she and I were getting married in a couple of months, so he needed to back off. He gave me a death look but didn't say anything. After an awkward silence, he left. After Aria had gotten back, I told her what went down. She asked me to describe him, and after I told her what he looked like, she said that was the same guy who came in before. She was a bit creeped out by what went down but found the fiancé excuse rather funny. She even stated she'd rather be engaged to me than go out with him, which I'm guessing was a compliment. A couple of weeks went by, and we had all but forgotten about the man. At this point, one night after it had gotten dark, Aria and I were getting the trash together so we could close down the registers and go home. Just then, we heard a bang at the door, causing both of us to nearly jump out of our skins. It was the guy again. He had a wild look in his eyes as he kept his face pressed against the glass. "We're closed," I told him, but he insisted he needed to come in. Aria yelled again to tell him she's not interested and for him to go away and leave her alone. But he yelled that he's not here for her, he's here for me. He then says that if he can take out her husband, then she'd be all his. Based on that, he wanted to kill me. I told Aria to run to the manager's office and call the police, and I'd stay here and watch him. I won't lie though, I was pretty afraid to be in that tiny little area. If the guy was able to get in, he wasn't the biggest guy, but he could have had a weapon on him. Plus, the store doesn't allow us to have self-defense items on us, so I was on my own here. The guy then started ramming the sliding doors like he was crazy. The doors were rattling. I could have sworn they were going to come off their base. Just then, Aria came running back around the corner with a 2x4 in her hand, yelling that the cops were on their way. Finally, the man decided to leave. The closing manager met the officers when they came, and he took them to review the cameras. Thankfully, the man was caught and arrested, but Arya and I felt unsafe working there any longer. We're still friends and even attend the same college together, but we have separate jobs now while we pay our way through classes. I'm glad she was there to help me with the rogue man, as I hate to imagine what he might have done to me, or worse, what he might have done to her. She says she's glad I was there for her as well, as having a guy around tends to make men like him less confident in what they might try. It was a wake-up call for me as to how dangerous it can be for some girls when an interested guy just doesn't want to take no for an answer. I used to work as a night clerk in a downtown condominium. The association had a lot of security concerns due to the way the building was constructed back in the late 60s. Both levels of the parking garage were accessible from street level, so there were a lot of possible entry points, many of which were located in blind spots of the security camera system. For that reason, I was required to make 2 rounds around the entire building during my shift to make sure no non-residents had found their way in. The most serious issue we had was the occasional carjacking, but what I encountered most often was homeless people who had found their way into the garage and were huddling in some corner for a bit of shelter. Kicking them back out into the street was by far my least favorite part of the job, but I had to do it. After working there for several months, I knew all the spots that people liked to hide in. The building was very old and had undergone many renovations in its lifetime, which created a lot of nooks and crannies, unnecessary concrete protrusions, sealed-off rooms, and hallways and stairs that led to nowhere. The creepiest spot in the whole building was so weird and potentially dangerous that I took a picture of it and brought it up to management. On the first floor of the garage, there was a door that opened up to a corridor directly underneath the ramp up to the second level of the garage. It was about 3 feet wide and ran about 20 to 30 feet, but it led to literally nowhere. At the end of it was a large water pipe with a valve, which was the only reason the space existed. But in the dark, with just a weak flashlight, that pipe seemed to take on many other forms. What made it dangerous, however, was the lock on the door. There was no padlock or keyhole on either side, but on the outside was a large sliding bolt latch. There was only one way in or out, and it locked from the outside with no way to unlock it from the inside. Ever since I discovered the spot, I couldn't help but imagine how easy it would be for someone to get trapped in there. However, nothing I said to management made any difference. They were already aware of it and had no intention of doing anything about it. Unfortunately, that meant I would have to open the door and check on it every night, but I never stepped foot inside of it. I was way too scared of it. Things went on like that for months, and then one day my worst fear was realized. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, halfway through my shift. I was doing my rounds in the parking garage, and everything was normal. It was a slow Wednesday night. There hadn't been any problems or suspicious activity on the cameras, so I was far from on edge at the time. But then, in one moment, I was forced to go on alert. I heard the sound of a door slamming across the garage. I wasn't exactly sure where it was, so I walked over to investigate. My heart sank a bit when I saw that the door to the dead-end hallway was wide open. I looked around to see if anyone was in the garage, but I appeared to be alone. I shouted to intimidate anyone if they were hiding somewhere I couldn't see, but I got no response and nobody appeared. I was just worried that there was somebody hiding in the dead-end hallway, so I walked the rest of the way. I shined my flashlight down the hallway, and for a moment, I was relieved to see that nobody was in there. There was, however, an empty glass bottle about 10 feet inside. I sighed and rolled my eyes, thinking that somebody had been drinking in there and had run out in a hurry once they saw me snooping around, accidentally making noise as they rushed. It wouldn't have been that hard for somebody to climb up on the cars parked there to get above the wall and hop the fence into the neighboring parking lot. By the time I got there, since the garage was partially underground in that spot, in fact, that's how a lot of people get in because the dead-end hallway happened to be in a prominent blind spot of the cameras. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to leave trash anywhere if I saw it, so I knew I had to pick up that bottle. Of course, I felt the anxiety bubbling up inside my gut just for knowing I had to walk a few steps inside that hallway. I almost didn't do it, but I rationalized myself into thinking there was no way somebody would pop out and lock me in. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, but right as I reached the bottle, the door slammed shut. I immediately ran back to the door, but by the time I got there, it was already locked. I started banging on the door and screaming for help, but there was nobody there. I felt like I was being buried alive, like I could barely breathe. If it weren't for my flashlight, I would have been in some deep trouble. I wouldn't have been able to see a thing. Once I realized I wasn't getting out anytime soon, I reached for my phone. To my utter heartbreak, however, there was no service at all. The walls were made of cinder blocks, the door was made of metal, and the entire 6-story building was on top of me. No matter what I tried, I couldn't call 911. There was absolutely nothing I could do. I was completely stuck. The only way I was getting out was if somebody opened the door from the outside. But it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and it would be hours before anybody left for work. During that time, whoever trapped me was doing whatever they pleased in the parking garage. I heard several car alarms go off, and I knew what was happening. Somehow, they all turned off after a few minutes. I kept banging on the door and shouting, but nobody came. After a while, if I'm being completely honest, I gave up hope that I would be free anytime soon and just focused on staying calm. I sat down against the wall and turned off my flashlight to save the battery, but only after making sure I was completely alone. Every few minutes, I banged on the door a bunch of times. It took me about 2 hours, but finally, I managed to get the attention of somebody going to work early in the morning. I thanked them as they let me out, but unfortunately, the next thing I had to do was call the cops because I quickly noticed that a dozen cars had been broken into. There was broken glass all over the parking lot from all the windows that had been shattered. Whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to trap me in there and how to silence the alarms of the cars they were breaking into. We only had security guards on the weekends, and it left us vulnerable on a seemingly benign Wednesday. All in all, there were tens of thousands of dollars in damages and theft, and I was fired from my job. Not that I would want to go back anyway. The culprit was never identified on the cameras and was never caught.